Damn it, I was muted. Thanks, guys. It's totally my fault. Yeah. No, it's you guys' fault. Okay. All right. So to start back over, welcome on in, everybody. Jube, Beans and Rice, Astanex, Earthbind, Necropolis. Thanks for letting me know that I'm the pro streamer as usual. Today, we'll be looking at a couple extra videos as per usual. Yesterday, we looked at the Dark Souls Iceberg Explained by Nat is Cool. Then we watched We Need to Talk About This Company with Asmongold reacting to a video by Charlie. I don't think I'm going to react to another react video like this again in the future, just because it probably gets a little bit overwhelming or tiring, keeping track of like three different like lines of thought as we go through it. So I'll try to keep it down to maybe a one react style video. Then after that, we watched Renala Cuts Spirit Summon Mechanic by Sekido Doobie, showing off her potential to summon Blythe in cut content. We also talked a little bit about how she was able to summon another child called Hermes, or Hirumes in Japanese, and how I found out that Hirumes is like another name for a character called Silver Mask in this anime or manga called Arslan or something like that. And then today we'll be going into how Elden Ring was made and why the director feels apologetic by ThatGuyGlen. I don't believe I've watched anything by ThatGuyGlen before, and I actually don't know a ton about how Elden Ring was made or why Miyazaki feels apologetic about Elden Ring specifically, because it seems like one of the most accessible games that they've made to me. The only thing that I kind of know about it is that it was made contemporaneously with the development of Sekiro, and they couldn't incorporate some of the lessons that they learned from Sekiro into Elden Ring because of that, which was a little bit surprising, but I guess it makes sense when you consider like the size and scope of Elden Ring. So after that, I thought we could go ahead and dive back on into another Madluigi video with Is Elden Ring Worthy of Best Narrative? I feel like this is going to be a very spicy video, if not from Madluigi, then either my reactions and or chat's reactions to this kind of video. And me. So after that, I figured why not keep the spice flowing Dune style and go into an Elden Ring critique by Crunchy. We've watched a couple of Crunchy's lore videos, but nothing quite this meta, so I'm curious as to his takes on this. And yeah, that's kind of the lineup for today. We might need to fill up some extra time, and if so, maybe we'll do like this Max Darrett video after or something like that. So anyway, hope you're all doing well. I'm doing pretty well. Scotchy Deer 50, welcome in. No, it was totally me. I make some pro streamer moves sometimes. Could have gotten away with it too if it weren't for this meddling chat, yeah. Will I ever do a Destiny stream? Unlikely, just because I play on PC now and I don't think my computer is capable of, well, yeah, there's a lot that goes into that. So running the Destiny is fine. I could probably run OBS with it, except when I've tried to record footage on OBS with it in the past, it's not been stellar. And then also, like, my internet bandwidth kind of sucks. So I just don't think it would make for a very good stream overall, because I would also need to, like, tunnel vision in on Destiny unless I'm, like, doing some, like, snooze fest strikes or something like that. And so I probably wouldn't be able to read chat super well. But thanks for asking. Oh yeah, we got Crunchy in chat. Nice to see you again, man. You ready to get that Dune spice flowing? And Zelda, nice to see you, clown. You watched the VOD, and as a WoW player, it was surreal seeing Asmongold on this stream. Yeah, I have played a bit of WoW in the past. Not like a crazy amount. Like I got really into it in Legion. I played on private servers before that when I was in college, so you know, watching the wallet. Ponyboy, nice to see you again. It's been a minute. Destiny is gross. Has been playing Destiny a lot lately. Yeah. The spice must flow. You mean coral? Corral. All right. So, intro segment over. Let's go ahead and dive into how Elden Ring was made and why the director feels apologetic by ThatGuyGlen. Yeah, I'm a big Hive enjoyer. Oh man, it's loud. How's the volume for you guys? Let me turn it down a smidge. And then I'll probably just need to turn it down on my end because it doesn't look that bad for stream. All right, here we go.
Elden Ring's development story begins in
I'll
2017,
turn it back
right
up.
after the Japanese game studio From Software was done with the last piece of DLC for Dark Souls 3. As with most From Software titles, renowned developer Hidetaka Miyazaki assumed the role of game director. He shared this position with Yu Tanimura, however, as he was also co-directing Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice at the same time. Directing two games concurrently presented quite a challenge for Miyazaki, especially because he likes to be involved in pretty much every aspect of development. He's often called himself a micromanager and helps pick out the right fonts, find the perfect shape for a specific sword, make sure trees have enough branches, and he even acts out certain movements to help animators translate his vision for how a character should move.
In some ways, I'm not surprised that he's a micromanager. Maybe I'm a little bit surprised that he goes out of his way to pick the correct fonts, because it's always been a little bit of a difficulty trying to get fonts that look comparable to the ones in game. I actually do kind of like a lot of the fonts that they use, though. So, just kind of a nerd moment on my part here.
It's also worth mentioning that Miyazaki doesn't only direct From Software games, he's also the representative director and president of the whole company. Therefore, it's certainly unusual for someone like Miyazaki to be as hands-on and creative as he is. But that's perhaps because he doesn't actually consider himself as part of management at the studio. Instead, he likes to be around his fellow developers to create a work relationship based on trust and compassion. The thing I prize is total openness from the staff. I try to be frank about my own mistakes. Because of my influence over these games, people are often reluctant to give their honest opinion, even when it may matter most. So I try not to let pride get involved and try to create trust. From the very beginning, Elden Ring was planned as being a more classic fantasy title as opposed to Sekiro, and while Miyazaki's development approach is very much the same for every project, there was one key difference this time around.
Hey Bella, welcome in. This is how Elden Ring was made and why the director feels apologetic by ThatGuyGlen, or Glenn is good. I'm so bad with names. ThatGuyGlen. Okay. So, yeah, I've been wondering like how much hands-on Miyazaki really is at the development of stuff. I mean, obviously, if you look at the credits, there's so many like level designers. I kind of feel a little bit of guilt because I know a lot of people are more aware of who did what on like the development team than I did. Like a lot of people really keep up with like Yui Tanimura and stuff like that, but I kind of feel like I should probably go back and look at who designed what levels, just because like Stormveil to me is like pinnacle FromSoft experience. Rei Lucaria is great as well, and it really reminds me a lot of Demon Souls, so I wonder if there's overlap there. And of course, like with Tanimura taking over Dark Souls 2, there is kind of an element of Dark Souls 2 to Elden Ring. All right, Jube, thanks for stepping in. You have a good night. All right, going back to the video.
Acclaimed fantasy author George R.R. Martin was brought on board to help shape the setting for what was about to become From Software's biggest and most successful title yet. Miyazaki is a huge fan of Martin's work and refers to Fever Dream as being his personal favorite, calling it a masterpiece among vampire fantasy. While the director wanted nothing...
You know, I haven't actually read anything by George yet. Maybe this would be a good thing to delve into, because I was waiting for... you know, A Song of Ice and Fire to conclude, but looks like I'm going to be waiting a hot minute more. So I've heard different things about his like writing style, so I'm just curious how I would enjoy it. You dug his Wildcard series? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously he's written a lot of other stuff, but is most known for A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, as it's more colloquially known. So maybe it would just make more sense to look at his other catalog first. Necromaster says, they know Miyazaki is a major part of the secret sauce that makes these games so good, but you wish FromSoft would be more open with who on the team handles different aspects of the games. I think that's just kind of how it goes, because, I mean, if you look at Nintendo, you could say, like, Miyamoto is the face of Nintendo as far as, like, game dev goes, but we don't even really know, like, how hands-on he is, or even, I guess Sakurai is like, another pretty well-known household name, but he's definitely like a lot more hands-on, I think, than a lot of other directors. Okay.
More than to team up with Martin, he fully expected to get turned down. Nonetheless, From Software's executive business director, Eiichi Nakajima, reached out to Martin who, to much surprise, agreed to have a meeting to discuss the project. Shortly after, Miyazaki flew out to America and sat down with the writer to talk about Elden Ring's themes, ideas, as well as many game-related aspects. It turns out Martin was already aware of the Dark Souls franchise, which gave Miyazaki a pleasant boost during their initial conversation. The whole experience was incredibly fun and engaging according to Miyazaki, and from that moment on, they both knew it was a perfect match. When dealing with narrative in From Software games, the developers like to focus on implementing lots of lore for the player to naturally discover through environmental storytelling, rather than to create a linear story-driven experience. However, this way of telling a story comes with a lot of restrictions for the writer. Now that George R.R. Martin was officially involved, Miyazaki wanted to avoid this problem so that Martin was able to unleash his full creativity for Elden Ring. Therefore, he suggested Martin should write about the history and the mythology of the setting and characters, rather than the game's actual story and in-game text. Martin agreed, and both parties would routinely meet in the following months to establish the foundation of the game's world. From Software presented him with very vague and broad ideas, along with the themes they typically like to explore. Based on this, the fantasy writer started detailing the overarching mythos and came back to Miyazaki with lots of ideas. This started a back and forth between the two, which felt very fresh to Miyazaki. Speaking to someone like Martin, who shares a deep affection for the fantasy genre, and to see him express the same kind of pure joy and sense of curiosity while filling in the historical events of Elden Ring, was a wonderful source of stimulus for the director. One of the vague ideas the team had before Martin was involved, for example, was the concept of the Elden Ring itself, although it wasn't an actual ring at that point, and how its destruction set things in motion. Furthermore, no visual elements, like the air trees for instance, were established at that point, so all of Martin's world-building ideas simply came from talking to Miyazaki.
I do kind of wish that we had sources for this info. Oh no, that's just the thumbnail. Or not thumbnail, like watermark. So that way we could look at the interviews directly and compare side by side. Not that this is a big deal. It would just be nice to have that kind of reference immediately available. Maybe it's in the video description. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's pretty sweet. All right, that'll be good enough for me. So yeah, for everybody who's in the Discord, we do have a compilation of the George R.R. Martin interviews, and I think that was originally like collated by Rubito the Red, or like the Red Scholar, if you know of him. He does a lot of work for compiling like community resources for like a ton of the FromSoft games. So thanks goes to him for like making that so easily accessible. What I was going to say is it's kind of ironic that George R.R. Martin allegedly went through all this work to craft the world of Elden Ring when it's still really kind of bare bones in a lot of ways and really frustrating to parse through its environmental storytelling and its lore. So just really ironic to me that Miyazaki's like, oh, I'm pretty bad at crafting stories, so if we got someone to help us, it'll be better. And then it's just kind of like typical FromSoft ambiguity and vagueness. Hey, Drew Wang, welcome back to the stream. And then Ponyboy said, George is never finishing that series. He got the bag and he's unofficially retired. I kind of have a feeling he may have like already finished the next book and he's just kind of writing the last book and not releasing them until like they're both done, just to avoid having to deal with the fans or not fans. I don't know. That it kind of makes sense to me. Like, I would hope that he'd already finished one book after however many years it's been at this point. But yeah. For what it's worth, I mean, he's got a better track record than Patrick Rothfuss right now, right? Yeah, Stephen King almost died and got into gear to finish The Dark Tower. Martin knows he's old and is only getting closer to death and he isn't even bothering. I don't really know about that. I feel like there's probably like a lot of stuff that we don't know going on behind the scenes. It's always interesting to hear the inspirations behind the artists you admire and love. Yeah. One of my favorite like George R.R. Martin interviews is the one where he like ask Stephen King like how the hell he writes so fast, which is just absolutely hilarious considering the context of everything. Yeah, sounds like cope. I mean, I'm not too invested into it, but yeah, it might be copium.
Famous author is of course mostly familiar with writing novels and short stories, but during the development of Elden Ring, his work read more like a guide that details the setting's flow of history and the figures who appear throughout it. These backstory details were then given to the entire team, who would then interpret them in their own way and provide the visuals to build the game. The actual text you see in Elden Ring, like NPC dialogue and item descriptions, is mostly written by Miyazaki himself. Before active development even started, the studio knew they wanted Elden Ring to be their biggest title yet in terms of sheer volume. This inevitably meant taking their first shot at the open world genre. Miyazaki felt confident enough tackling such a daunting task now that the studio had grown over many years and garnered plenty of talented developers. To get a better understanding of the open world genre, Miyazaki studied games like The Elder Scrolls and Grand Theft Auto.
This isn't relevance, but hey, look, we've got Vargrim, or the Raging Wolf with the 2 scavenger curved swords, aka like my canonical character for my lore videos, because of this. Typically, he uses like the bastard sword and one of the round shields. I think it's like the iron round shield or something like that. Not too important, but it just distracted me.
Of the open world genre, Miyazaki studied games like The Elder Scrolls and Grand Theft Auto. He admitted in an interview with 4Players that no title served a specific inspiration, but he did mention how much respect he has for the design and the amount of freedom the player has in The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Fumito Ueda's work, especially Shadow of the Colossus, did inspire the look and feel of the landscape in Elden Ring. Aside from video games, works like Lord of the Rings and the Eternal Champion novels had a great impact on Miyazaki's vision for Elden Ring. All that being said, however, Miyazaki mainly focused on creating his own ideal game. I don't approach it in terms of, this is the kind of open world game I want to make. It's just that the open world enriches this ideal experience I'm trying to achieve. To give some very simple examples, if I was to explore this world, I'd want a map, a proper map. Or, you know, if I saw something over there, I'd want to actually be able to go over and explore it. And I'd want to fight a dragon in an epic arena. Things like this. It's very simple stuff, but Elden Ring allows a lot of these things to become a reality for me, creating something that's very close to my ideal game.
And obviously that sounds like a no-brainer that a dev should want to create a game that they themselves want to play, but unfortunately it doesn't actually seem to be as common as I think gamers would like, especially because of more and more things like microtransactions, battle passes, live service games, things like that. Which isn't to say that those things can't be good. It's just being maybe a little bit overdone and feels like it's being done for player metrics rather than something that's created more holistically.
Before we move on, I'd like to talk about this video's sponsor, Keeps. Keeps is a subscription service that helps men keep their hair by offering clinically proven treatments that are delivered straight to your door. To help you get started, simply go to keeps.com and answer a few quick questions to find a treatment plan tailored to your needs. Whether you're looking to prevent hair loss, stimulate hair growth, or just take better care of the hair you have, Keeps has you covered. Their network of expert medical advisors, prescribers, and care specialists will select the right products for a fair price to help make sure you reach your desired hair goals. Each treatment plan also comes with a full year of unlimited messaging, so you can connect with your prescribing doctor and get expert quality care at any time from the comfort of your own home. To summarize, Keeps is all about personalized doctor-recommended treatments that help keep your hair for about half the cost of traditional pharmacy products, without ever even leaving your couch. To get 50% off your first order, go to keeps.com/ThatGuyGlen or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/ThatGuyGlen. Hair loss stops with Keeps. Now back to the video. It almost goes without saying that From Software's previous titles, going all the way back to Kingsfield, laid the groundwork for Elden Ring's level design, RPG elements, combat-related systems, and balancing the difficulty. Unsurprisingly, Dark Souls is the one franchise the studio leaned on the most, said Miyazaki, going as far as calling Elden Ring a natural evolution of the popular trilogy. That being said, taking all the things they learned from Dark Souls and applying it to a huge open world came with its own set of unique challenges. One of the trickier obstacles was trying to stop the player from getting bored. Unlike Dark Souls, where the devs were able to craft a more controlled and linear experience, Elden Ring allows for a much greater amount of progression and reward no matter which direction a player takes. Player freedom was at the heart of the game's core design. Because of this,
And obviously, while there are some limitations to the player freedom, I do think it's quite admirable how well they made that work for the most part. I do think they could have done a lot of things to tweak players' experiences. And like one of the more common things that I say is like if they had the nomadic merchants strewn throughout the world have like items comparable to the area that they were at, it would give players a better sense of like what they were dealing with, and or it could allow players to just kind of stay at level if they were able to purchase items that were at the base level of that area. Maybe a little bit too strong if you go to like the end areas of the game first and then back to the beginning, but oh well. Maybe if they just sold upgrade stones instead. I digress.
the team had to account for every single direction the player could take when they see that vast open world for the first time. In other words, the pacing for every possible scenario had to be perfect. For the most part, this essentially meant incorporating lots of characters, enemies, and events for the player to discover throughout their adventures. Miyazaki recalls how much
Is anyone else sad that we never got the Ancient Dragon in Caelid? I wonder if they replaced this one with, what's its face? X-Ikes. Kind of looks like the same spot, but maybe it's a little bit different.
For the most part, this essentially meant incorporating lots
No, because we got ruins over here.
of characters.
It almost looks like a, what's it called? The thing that they pull, caravan.
Enemies.
Then this part kind of looks like
events for the player to
normal. Okay, so we've got. So this might be about like Calum ruins if you could see the minor Erd tree.
discover throughout their adventure.
No. Where's this graveyard in that pillar? Oh no! So this must be because if that's the divine, yeah, that's the divine tower. So did this Erd tree used to have like gold? No, that's the real Erd tree. I'm an idiot.
Miyazaki recalls
Anyway.
how much more difficult this was in an
Yeah,
open world,
Dragon
however,
Barrow.
versus how they did it in Dark Souls. You don't want anything to tread on the toes of anything else. You want it to all mingle and to mesh nicely with the player and their own motivations as well, but you want it to be there and you wanted to provide that stimulation for progressing forward and exploring, so that was probably one of the biggest challenges. Miyazaki realized the amount of freedom and agency Elden Ring provides might be overwhelming to some players who just want to experience the main story, so From Software tried to combat this by implementing the Guidance of Grace. It points players in the direction of the next story quest in an unobtrusive way. While it's a valid option to experience the bare minimum, refusing to follow the guidance is a choice in and of itself that can feel meaningful to the player, according to Miyazaki. The guidance is both visible during gameplay and on the map screen. Speaking of the map, the developers wanted exploration.
And my favorite thing about the whole Guidance of Grace thing is that it immediately points people into facing Margit, who will just kind of pub stomp most players, veterans and initiates alike.
During gameplay and on the map screen. Speaking of the map, the developers wanted exploration to feel varied and exciting, even after dozens of hours of playing. To create that sense of variation, the team developed a system where the player is either exploring a completely unknown area, or exploring a location with a better sense of what's to come. See, the map starts out with little to no detail, but as you progress through surrounding areas, you can pick up map fragments which only reveal the layout of certain chunks on the map. It might make it easier to decide where to go next at that point, but it doesn't take away from the fun of discovery in the game, since you
I think one of the best things they did with the map was just having it not fully zoom out when you first get it. So that way when you like get to the next area, like, oh, it's this big. And then you get to the next one, it's like, oh, it's even bigger. And then eventually you're just like, holy crap. Why does my computer do this? It's only when I stream, so I'm going to blame OBS. So yeah, I feel like the map is definitely one of the best features of Elden Ring, or best newer features of Elden Ring for sure.
You don't know if there's going to be lots of enemies, a new boss, friendly NPCs, or anything else. It's certainly possible to beat Elden Ring without collecting any map fragments, but Miyazaki himself thinks it's more fun to explore with a map, which is why he and the team made it easy to collect them. While the map is definitely useful to plan where you're going next, Miyazaki felt it important to also include plenty of visual landmarks to help players find their way and to nudge them in a certain direction. The giant air trees are a good example of.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the best things that they did as far as like level design goes. They make things look visually distinct from each other, and as though there's always something there beyond the horizon that you can go and visit. So just from like this vantage alone, you can see Raya Lucaria, you can kind of see the not so swampy Liurnia of the lakes between it. You got the caves over there with like the Albanorc village, the Divine Tower here, the Carian Study Hall, Mount Gelmir in the distance, the Minor Erd Tree, this other Minor Erd Tree, and then you should have the actual Erd Tree even further off to the right there.
This, apart from serving as a land.
And even with Stormvale, you have Stormvale Castle itself jutted up into the sky, Holly Church, the real Erd Tree, the Divine like Tower going off of that. And then, yeah, they just did a crazy good job making the world open, vast, but also kind of filling it with enough things to keep people entertained. Even though I do think that is actually like one of the weaker parts of the game overall, the more you play it, just because the reward incentive to keep exploring kind of diminishes the more and more you play it. I do kind of wish that after you completed the game, they would add in like a randomizer or something else in New Game Plus to like change things around, because repeated plays gets more and more stale, unfortunately.
Landmarks, the air trees also represent the visual identity of Elden Ring and make it easy for people to instantly recognize what game they're looking at. Additionally, the giant glowing trees perfectly capture the spirit of what Miyazaki always tries to achieve with his worlds, which is beauty surrounded by darkness. Light looks more beautiful in darkness. When there is something beautiful in the middle of a wasteland, we are able to appreciate it more. One jewel doesn't look like much when you have a pile of them, but if you find one jewel in the midst of mud, it is worth so much more. Personally, a world that is happy and bright is something that just doesn't feel realistic to me. It may sound like I have a trauma or something, but I believe that the world is generally a wasteland that is not kind to us. That's just the way I see it. Although finding beauty in darkness is a common theme in From Software games, Miyazaki wanted Elden Ring to feel more mythological compared to Dark Souls. This is why the overworld and setting, called the Lands Between, is specifically designed to invoke the sense of mystery and the unknown. The starting area especially needed to feel like an invitation to this vast open world that's ripe to explore. It's
Nope, Chuck Testa, get tree sentineled. Bella said they love open world games because of their scale, but she also has anxiety about completing everything / picking up every item. Anxiety in the sense of you feel the need to go collect everything, or do you feel anxiety because it's just a little bit overwhelming? I'm assuming the latter, but I'm just a little bit curious. The world is a poison swamp. We're all struggling through it. Yeah. So the funniest thing to me is a lot of people really want a Miquella-based DLC, but I don't think they realize that they're asking for a Melania DLC with that. So they're going to get the Lake of Rot 2.0, where you can't even sprint through it. So you'll just have to rely on Bloodhound Step.
It's therefore no coincidence that one of the first things you see as a player is a giant glowing air tree, which gives off a very mystical and ethereal presence. As a result, the game looks more vibrant with color compared to previous Souls games.
You know what? Because the captions actually had Erd Tree correct. This is my first time like noticing that these aren't just auto-generated. Little nice change of pace there. Yeah, Bella wants to collect everything. Maybe you shouldn't have used the word anxiety, more like obsession. Understandable, yeah. I'm kind of like Peter Griffin, or I'm like, ooh, piece of candy. And then I just get completely distracted and go off everywhere except where I'm supposed to go.
As a result, the game looks more vibrant with color compared to previous Souls games. Miyazaki explained they intentionally added more color to communicate that the Golden Age has passed through the lands of Elden Ring's world, and that the player can still see traces of it. The team also wanted to provide the lands between with a much more painterly look that better fits the high fantasy theme they were aiming for. What's more, Miyazaki thought it would be too oppressive if such a large open world was brimming with darkness the entire time. Instead, it was the perfect opportunity to show the appeal of both a light side and a darker side that's more reminiscent of what players come to expect from the studio's previous work. The mythological theme is also present within lots of the boss designs and have a heroic appearance as a result. Some might not exactly look heroic, but do have a tragic background of once being heroic before falling from grace. This same concept was further applied to the various skills, weapons, shields and spells, which is why they all seem more godly and impressive than in previous Souls games. In the world of Elden Ring, they're meant to be used as tools for defeating mythological heroes. Curiously, Miyazaki said in an interview with Famitsu that all the armors were designed with cosplay potential in mind, although it still had to look good and make sense in the game itself, of course.
Wait, they designed it with cosplay in mind? That's crazy. That's such, like, 4D chess right there.
Curiously, Miyazaki said in an interview with Famitsu that all the armors were designed with cosplay potential in mind.
It's really funny that he uses a picture of Radahn with that. I kind of wish he used a picture of Rykard with this instead. Oh man, I can't wait to see like a full-on Rykard cosplay. I actually think I did see one and it looked really goofy. Anyway, Nectarine, welcome back to the stream, as well as Elden Enthusiast. You got so mad when you found a swamp at the bottom of the Ringed City, and that one you couldn't even like sprint through, and then it has like all the children of Rot shooting their webs. Good times.
Although it still had to look good and make sense in the game itself, of course. When it was decided to develop an open world game, Miyazaki knew from the start they would need a faster way of exploring the setting than just going by foot. The team prioritized ease of use and wanted something to appear when needed and disappear again when the player decides to explore back on foot. Mounting and dismounting also had to be almost seamless and feel good to use. Aside from being faster, it also needed to expand the player's options during 3-dimensional movement, so it would make exploration more interesting. All these requirements culminated into the idea of designing a spectral steed called Torrent that fits the established mythological theme and has the ability to double jump. As mentioned before, Sekiro was being developed alongside Elden Ring at From Software Studio, but it's Miyazaki's understanding that there weren't any direct influences or decisions being made based on Sekiro's development. That being said, he does believe there were some indirect inspirations taken from the game. For example, the enemy stance break mechanic is similar to Sekiro's posture system. While the mechanic initially came from wanting to add more depth to the Dark Souls-like combat, it was probably further expanded thanks to Sekiro's active development.
I do wish that they incorporated the Sekiro Goomba Stomp, where you could jump off an enemy to help like mess with their posture a little bit. Not that Elden Ring really needs it, but I think it would have added a little bit more spice to combat, especially being able to jump over some of the enemies like sweeping attacks. But overall, combat is good. I do wish they took more from Sekiro in terms of like the ebb and flow of combat to a certain degree, but maybe if they had a weapon or like a branch of weapons that had like a Sekiro style parry that didn't completely like open up an enemy for like a riposte unless you like continue to break open their stance a bit more, that would have been super cool. I also wish Elden Ring had a couple trick weapons, but one can only dream. The DLC will fix it, right guys? Torrent's a million trillion times better than the Breath of the Wild horses. I mean, Mikiti counter. That would be such a cool, like, Ash of War or something like that. Imagine Mikiti countering the Elden Beast stab attack. That would actually be really dope. Elden Enthusiast wants to dress up as Moog for Halloween, but you don't want to explain to people, no, I'm not dressed up as the devil. You're dressed as a pedophile. Yeah. Good luck with that.
It was probably further expanded thanks to Sekiro's active development. As some of you watching may know, Sekiro is a lot more direct in regards to its storytelling compared to previous Souls-like titles, and this is somewhat true for Elden Ring as well, according to Miyazaki. It's still a fragmented narrative mostly being put together by the player themselves, but there's a bigger focus on human elements and drama with more straightforward NPC dialogue that's meant to help players explore the open world and find interesting locations. Lastly, Sekiro's more fast-paced reversal was also referenced when they were creating the horse mounting system. There is a noticeable difference when comparing Elden Ring to other open-world games, and that's that there's no settlements or large cities that are populated with residents, it being their first open-world.
I really do wish there were a lot more settlements strewn out throughout the lands between areas, whether they be more like the Frenzy Flame Village or Nox, or not Nox, but like Celia or Dina, those type of things, because it makes the world feel a bit more lived in to me, even if they're kind of mostly empty and dilapidated in this like bygone age.
World title, the developer.
Or even especially like Volcano Manor, when you get down to the lower section, that felt a lot like Yarnum to me, and I was like, oh, we're back. But it was just a very small segment of that area, unfortunately. Don't forget Jarburg. Yeah, Jarburg's great. Just more stuff like that.
Large cities that are populated with residents. It being their first open-world title, the developers thought including populated cities was going to be too much work and wanted to focus on their strengths instead.
I feel
Despite that, the game kept increasing in scope and becoming more complex than initially planned, forcing the studio to increase the size of the team as well as outsourcing more tasks. Luckily, the team was able to explore some new procedural systems that allowed them to fill out the world in ways that didn't require people to always be hands-on and do it manually. During an interview with Games Radar, Miyazaki gave the example of creating and placing trees and vegetation. About 80% of that task was done with a procedural system, followed by artists going in and adding the finishing touches by hand. Graphical fidelity is not something From Software necessarily.
So that's interesting. Should that mean we like ignore much of the flora for environmental lore storytelling purposes?
Strives towards with any of their projects, and the studio rather likes to focus on creating unique looking worlds and characters. However, the graphics department did feel more pressure than usual this time, and it was all because of Demon Souls, one of their previous games that basically started the whole Souls-like genre. The Demon Souls remake developed by Bluepoint Games was released on PS5 in 2020 and featured impressive graphics that went well beyond From Software's latest games at the time, Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro. While Miyazaki acknowledged how great it looked, it wasn't his #1 priority to match what Bluepoint had achieved. He did say that the graphics team and programmers pushed a lot of new features to create the best looking game the studio has ever made.
So yeah, Elden Ring did win like best visual design or something like that of a game at the Game Awards, which was a little bit surprising to me. Not because I don't think it looks bad or anything, but I also don't think Miyazaki should have felt as pressured to live up to like the legacy of Bluepoint, because obviously Bluepoint was only working on the architecture of the PS5, whereas they were trying to make Elden Ring work with older generation consoles like the PS4 and the Xbox, whatever version you want to put here. Hey Corporate Nothing, nice to see you again. Yeah, Crunchy says there's a difference between fidelity and design, and that's a fantastic way of putting it. I always compare the FromSoft games to a painting by Monet, where it's really, really beautiful and pretty from a distance, but the more up close you go, the more of a hot mess it kind of ends up looking. But yeah. And yeah, to go along with Crunchy's comment here about fidelity and design, I always say you shouldn't necessarily judge a game by its graphics. However, I think it's perfectly justifiable to judge it by its art style, if that makes sense. Crunky.
It's no secret From Software likes to make more difficult experiences, or at least games where the player dies more frequently, and this stems from Miyazaki's own history playing video games. I've never been a very skilled player. I die a lot. So, in my work, I want to answer the question, if death is to be more than a mark of failure, how do I give it meaning? How do I make death enjoyable? I do feel apologetic toward anyone who feels there's just too much to overcome in my games. I just want as many players as possible to experience the joy that comes from overcoming hardship. He went on to say it's not something they're thinking of abandoning anytime soon, emphasizing that creating challenging and difficult experiences is part of their identity. It's not that the studio is trying to make difficult games for the sake of making difficult games, but instead they focus on creating scenarios where players die in interesting or amusing ways. They want...
Yeah, and that's kind of like one of my favorites of these games. It's like when you die, you can generally tell when it's your fault. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of a jankiness here and there, but there's also this kind of like inherent humor for a lot of these deaths. So like if you look at my like be right back screens, it's mostly just compilations of me dying in ridiculous ways. One of my funniest deaths to me in Dark Souls 1 was getting to the bottom of the damn Ashen Hollow, and the tree there, made it through all the basilisks, all the drops, got to the bottom, and I got punched to death by a giant mushroom with their like goofy looking animations. And at that point, I was like, why didn't I just run away? It's a giant mushroom. It's going to take forever to even try to follow me, and it's not going to catch up to me. It was just really... I don't even know how to describe it.
Want people to walk away with an entertaining story they can share with others. What's more, From Software tries to design their games to make the cycle of repeatedly trying to overcome these challenges enjoyable in and of itself. They want players to use their cunning, study the game, memorize what's happening, and learn from their mistakes. The last thing they want is for the experience to feel unfairly punishing. With that said, From Software set out to make their most accessible game as of yet, and added multiple new ways to ease players into the experience and give them an optional edge during tougher battles. For starters, the open world this time around encourages players to explore other areas when things get too tough in a certain part of the game. They can then upgrade their gear and come back to that difficult location with newfound spirit and strength. The much bigger and open world also means players have more agency to dictate their approach on handling enemies far in the distance, making stealth a viable option for instance. There's an item called the Bird's-Eye Telescope that's meant for exactly doing that. There's also the addition of spirit summons, which provide temporary support while battling a boss or other enemies. Miyazaki is personally fond of the collection aspect that's attached to them, and might give players an extra reason to explore as much as possible. A crafting system is also present, and this was implemented to let players go on for longer in the open setting without feeling too stressed about running out of items. It's for the same reason there's also more resources to recover health during your adventures, and why defeating groups of enemies recovers your flask charges.
Alright, I was just about to mention that, yeah. The way that they facilitate players being able to continue on in their quest throughout the world is just so good that it feels completely natural and is extremely easy to forget that it's even there with like the flask regeneration system, at least for me. Obviously I do think like crafting a lot of these other systems could have used a bit of work, but overall I do agree that Elden Ring is a lot more accessible than its previous games. And well, I've never particularly thought that these games are like ridiculously difficult, because they can be kind of overcome with a lot of dedication and persistence. They tend to offer a lot of like the highest highs in gaming when you do finally beat that thing that you've been crashing on for like hours on end. So there's certainly a couple lows with like the poisonous swamps, but I feel like they serve their purpose to make the highs feel even higher.
Wider selection of weapons, magic, items, and the ability to add any skill to any weapon also makes it more convenient than ever before for players to find a style of play that suits them. Lastly, they've reduced the number of hoops players have to go through to enjoy the multiplayer aspects, making summoning other players for help a more attractive option. In the beginning of 2022...
I don't necessarily agree with that one specifically, just because we had to have third-party folk create like the seamless co-op mod and stuff like that. They definitely do need to modernize their multiplayer going forward. Actually, I don't know how good AC6 is in that regard, so maybe I might be wrong. Maybe they have been working on it, but at least for PvP and multiplayer and invasions, like it's a little bit of a slog sometimes trying to connect with someone you know, especially.
Once development was almost done, Miyazaki told Games Radar that he wasn't feeling well. It's not a pretty state of mind, I will tell you that. This is a tough point in the development of any game, not just Elden Ring. At this point, this is when I really start to have regrets and doubts about releasing the game into the wild and seeing what everybody thinks. I start
Yeah, that's just really relatable, I think, for anybody who produces content. And I'm not just saying, like, oh, these streams are, like, making Elden Ring. No, no, no. I mean something like where you pour, like, a lot of creative work into it, like, writing, developing games, things like that. You always feel like perhaps it could take some more time in the oven if you're really self-conscious about, like, the praise and criticism that you may receive. So I can only imagine how much worse that pressure is when you're like the head of a multi-million-dollar company whose work helps and supports like the livelihoods of so many people and their families and stuff like that. After buying the consumables in Dark Souls 3, the crafting felt tedious. Yeah, it is a little bit tedious. I think it's better than nothing, but I feel like the crafting is just kind of meant to flesh out the open world, and it's just kind of like an illusion to hide like how barren it would be otherwise, which it really would be. So it serves a purpose. Hey, Teen Seth, nice to see you again. How's it going?
thinking, I could have maybe done this better. I could have maybe approached this in a different way. There's a lot of these thoughts that build up just on the cusp of a game's release, that are involuntary and they plague your mind a little bit as you're finishing off work on the project. It's a tough time, and it doesn't get easier with experience.
And I think like another thing that goes along with that, it's really crazy to me how different the 1.0 version of Elden Ring is compared to all of their other games that I've seen.
Cope with his feelings.
So yeah, just to give more context on that. So they really did do like a lot of extra work after the game went quote unquote gold.
It's a tough time, and it doesn't get easier with experience. To cope with his feelings of doubts near the peak of any game project, Miyazaki likes to retreat into his office that's full of creative inspiration to surround himself with. There's also books, video games, a fridge, anything he needs for him to basically live there. He jokingly added there's no bathroom, so he does go home to take showers. On February 25th, 2022, Elden Ring was finally released after much hype and anticipation. Everyone was talking about From Software's newest title, and to say people were pleased with how the game turned out is probably understating it. With a 95 on Metacritic and reaching the number 4 spot on OpenCritic, with only Red Dead Redemption 2, Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey having a higher score, it's safe to say Elden Ring has been one of the biggest releases of 2022 so far. On top of that, almost 900,000 viewers were watching streamers play Elden Ring on Twitch within 24 hours after release. Only Lost Ark and Cyberpunk 2077 debuted with better numbers on the streaming platform. In November 2021, after it was announced that Elden Ring had been delayed from January to February 2022, publisher Namco Bandai stated in a Q&A with investors that they expected Elden Ring to sell 4 million copies within the first 5 weeks of release. Yet, after just 17 days, 12 million copies were sold worldwide. To put that into better perspective, it outsold Dark Souls 3, which sold 10 million copies in total in less than 3 weeks. The entire
Yeah, and I think it also helps that Elden Ring was on so many consoles, but it was just kind of crazy how it took off. It did help that there weren't like a lot of games directly competing against it at that time. I do remember, obviously, the Destiny 2 Witch Queen expansion came out like literally 3 days before Elden Ring came out, so I was rushing to get through that and then get into Elden Ring. So a lot of action for me in that time period. Oh yeah, Horizon Forbidden West. Yeah, that one kind of really fell off, which was surprising. But yeah, that's true. That one did come out. Wasn't that like a month after Elden Ring? It just got the Horizon Zero Dawn diehards were seething. Yeah, that one. It certainly that's really the true shadow of the Erd Tree right there, isn't it?
Dark Souls franchise has sold 27 million copies since 2020. Even compared to other open world games, Elden Ring puts up impressive numbers. Ars Technica published an article that compares sales numbers and shows how From Software's open world title sold more copies in the same time span as GTA 4, Skyrim, The Witcher 3, and Zelda Breath of the Wild. It's safe to say that the studio's first attempt at an open world game is an immense commercial and critical success. From Software's future is looking brighter than ever. Elden Ring is almost certainly a Game of the Year contender, and who knows how many copies it's going to sell in the next couple of months. There's also a strong suspicion that the game will receive DLC in the near future, given that data miner Lance McDonald found an abandoned coliseum that's currently inaccessible. It might hint at some sort of planned PvP update, but perhaps it's just content that was cut during development. It's worth mentioning, however, that all three Dark Souls games...
It's kind of fun to see the speculation about this stuff at the time. Yeah, obviously some of those coliseums are still in the game. I haven't seen Lance's video on that, but probably was a completely different coliseum there. So, Teen Sith said, Forbidden West is a good game, don't get you wrong. Charm is the word you keep coming back to, trying to describe Elden Ring. Elden Ring is a really charming game to you? Yeah, so, yeah, I'm not trying to say, like, Horizon Forbidden West is a bad game or anything like that. It's just, like, after the timing of Elden Ring coming out, and then the word of mouth just absolutely building and building and building about it, it just really, overshadowed the release of Horizon. Ponyboy said, Horizon got screwed by FromSoft's release date twice, actually. It's really sad for them, and you think it's why they talk so much crap about Elden Ring? They were probably a bit bitter. Yeah, that's understandable. They should have pushed it back. It's a little bit easier said than done. And Necropolis also said they did that twice with Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring. Yeah, sometimes that's just how the cookie crumbles. Oof.
Games received similar PvP updates in the past, so all the speculation is certainly warranted. Whatever happens with Elden Ring in the future, it no doubt already made its mark on the gaming industry, and Miyazaki believes the game will have a strong influence on what they decide to develop next. Whether that means a sequel or a completely new open world game is anyone's guess for now, but fans are most likely already looking forward to it.
Drew Wing said, they played the hell out of the first Horizon, but the second just felt so exhausting with the map icons. Yeah, I heard there was like a decent amount of controversy with how people felt about the maps and stuff. Not maps, but like all of like the HUD elements and stuff. So, okay. Wait, why are we not... Why is my playlist not up? That's annoying. Okay, so anyway, that was ThatGuyGlen's How Elden Ring Was Made and Why the Director Feels Apologetic. So I already went ahead and linked it into chat if you guys want to give them a like and a sub. I want to see what other kind of content they produce. That was a pretty good, straightforward video. Ooh, Risk of Rain. Okay, yep, this looks like a channel for me. All right, I'm definitely subbing. Okay. Yeah, so go ahead, give him a like and a sub if you enjoyed that video. I learned quite a few things from this one myself, so I liked it. Nothingness said, why your suggestion didn't make it to the screen chat? Can other people see your previous post? Yeah, sometimes I don't know, YouTube just kind of like doesn't show everything. It's really annoying, to be honest. But if something gets eaten, and if it's not on my left side chat right over here, go ahead and just like post it again. I won't get angry. Maybe others will. Ponyboy thinks that Horizon was slated intentionally to dodge the Elden Ring initial release date, and then Elden Ring got pushed back. So Horizon pushed theirs back was not doable. Yeah. Teensis says they like the number of accessibility and controller settings in Forbidden West, but it definitely suffers a bit from the sandbox collectible disease. Yeah, a lot of modern games kind of like run into that issue. So I heard like a lot of devs were, maybe not like actually like a lot of devs, but some devs were very vocal critics about Elden Ring's quest design and stuff like that, which is just kind of funny. And it's really easy to just like dunk on devs who feel that way, like, oh, they don't really understand that they're trying to make a product for the people that this is appealing to, so their complaints are just kind of falling on deaf ears. It's a little bit unfortunate. Wait, what did you suggest? Because I didn't get your suggestion, Necropolis, or Nothingness, my fault. Welcome back to the chat. Elden Ring feels like the end? I don't know about that. All right. That was weird. That it didn't go into like my playlist. Okay. You think YouTube hates vid titles as well? Did you type it again just now? Did it get eaten twice? Can anybody else in chat actually see what Nothingness had suggested? Yeah, so if YouTube keeps eating those comments, just go ahead and let me know. Okay, you can't see it, Teen Sith? Yeah, if YouTube's chat keeps eating those kind of comments, just let me know in like the video comments or on the Discord, which I guess I didn't pin that earlier today. Let me scroll all the way up. Okay, so the Discord is pinned at the top. It's also in my video description there somewhere. So if you want me to react to something on stream, go ahead and put it there. I'll try to remember to add it later because I will immediately forget what you guys told me right here in chat right now. Crunchy said, Elden Ring is not the end, but in accordance with an ancient pact with Miyazaki, leads to renewed Eternal Souls games. It's all good, Nothingness. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that was a good video. Let's go ahead to the next one with our first dose of True Spice, potentially, with Madluigi's Is Elden Ring Worthy of Best Narrative? 9 months ago.
Hi everyone, Madluigi here with an Elden Ring video a bit different than my usual. In case you missed it, there's been some discussion going on surrounding Elden Ring and the Game Awards. Elden Ring has been nominated for quite a few awards, including Best Narrative, which has caused a bit of fallout from people incredulous about the nomination, saying Elden Ring has no story or one much worse than other nominees like God of War Ragnarok. Then there are others incredulous at those people, saying Elden Ring has a great unique narrative that just isn't spoon-fed to the player. Now, because I'm a lorehead who delves deep into the stories in Elden Ring, and because Elden Ring's DLC announcement could very well take place at the Game Awards, maybe, hopefully, I wanted to spend a little time talking about the narrative of Elden Ring and my thoughts on the whole matter. As we get started, feel free to subscribe if you aren't already, as that oddly includes most of you who are returning viewers. And with that, enjoy.
You just call out the entire audience, why don't you? Hey guys, sub to me too. Little Birdie reminded me to make more calls to actions.
And before we get into the thick of it, it seems to me that this discussion is just a symptom of a larger conversation, basically the Game of the Year battle between Elden Ring and God of War. They both came out this year, so unfortunately they get compared, even though they are very different games. On the one hand, God of War is a generally linear action-adventure game with a straightforward narrative featuring a father figure often protecting his son. It also has a set small number of weapons that you upgrade skills for. On the other hand, Elden Ring is not any of that, but funnily enough, that description fits like a glove onto From Software's previous action game, Sekiro. Literally everything I said, from weapon skills to narrative, applies to Sekiro, making it a much better game to talk about in conversation with God of War. But that's not how we do things as a society, so let's get into Elden Ring versus God of War and see what's missing from the narrative discourse. To start, I think I'm in a good position to make this video. For one, I obviously have a pedigree of investment and appreciation of From Software's approach to storytelling. I have a Dark Souls 3 video all about how the placement of just one item tells a story and provides context for the area and the world. A really good piece of environmental storytelling that From Software is really big on in their narrative approach. And I have an Elden Ring video all about the themes of struggle and perseverance that the game really emphasizes both in story and in gameplay, reifying that story. So
I remember seeing that title a long time ago and I haven't watched it. Maybe that'll be something I should add to the list because, I mean, I kind of immediately agree just with the title of it alone. So, just seems like a fun one to watch. Nothingness says, does God of War have replayability value? I almost feel like asking does Elden Ring as soon as you like explore everything. But yeah, I guess not everybody will explore as much as they possibly can like I did the first time round. So yeah, I don't know. The TGA categories are whack. Yeah, so trying to decide whether or not I'm going to get into the idea of like narrative versus plot versus lore. But maybe I'll let Luigi speak a bit more for himself there. Stella thinks things like best narratives are incredibly subjective and doing awards for it is an exercise in futility. Maybe a little bit. Teen Sith says, you wouldn't think God of War has replay value outside of achievement hunts or challenge runs, not gonna lie. Okay.
Really emphasizes both in story and in gameplay reifying that story. So I am one who can see the merit in the narrative aspects of the game. But at the same time, I think I may fall into a different boat than a lot of the other Elden Ring creators defending the game. Obviously they have a similar appreciation for the game's storytelling, but I think, from what I've seen, that they haven't been adequately responding to the issues people have with the nomination. I basically think that they're giving Elden Ring too much credit when it should be criticized or at least acknowledged to have a pretty mediocre, at best, active story or plot. And not
Ooh. So yeah, I was a little bit afraid that Luigi was going to be on the more apologetic side of Elden Ring enthusiasts, but he seems to be more on my side, the dark side, that's critical of the game and its narrative. Teen Sith says, honestly, narrative delivery is so drastically different between God of War and Elden Ring, you wouldn't think to compare them. So that's kind of the trouble of having such a broad collection of games to fit in that category of like narrative in the Game Awards. So I think even before getting that, we should probably establish like what narrative means to like us individually versus like what it means in the context of the Game Awards and kind of move from there. Because otherwise it's just going to be like probably differences of opinion due to differing ideas of like what narrative really means.
Not to say that there aren't toxic people claiming Elden Ring has no narrative merit. They are obviously wrong. But so too are Elden Ring stands that are deriding other games unconstructively, saying things like a cutscene-fueled story, which is the traditional way of storytelling in video games, is basically more of a movie than a game. I didn't know we were saying Metal Gear games aren't games anymore. So the Game Awards defines the criteria for the Best Narrative Award as the following: for outstanding storytelling and narrative development in a game. People are upset that Elden Ring is in the running versus a game like God of War Ragnarok, which has much more clearer, straightforward storytelling and narrative development. Now, I actually think Elden Ring has fantastic storytelling, but its narrative development, like most From Software games, is pretty mediocre in my opinion. We could bicker a bit about what narrative development means and argue Elden Ring's cryptic, piecemeal storytelling counts as a form of narrative, but I think we'll have a better discussion if we can agree to just talk about the main present narrative or story of the game. Basically, this would exclude the storytelling found in Elden Ring's lore, which anybody watching my channel will probably agree is done really well. But that's not what I think the core issue is in this discussion. Many players go through Elden Ring or the Soul series not really knowing what they're doing plot-wise. The same isn't true for God of War. Whatever that discrepancy is what I want to talk about in this video. There is plenty to piece together in Elden Ring. There are complex factions and characters with varied motivations that you can learn intimate details about. But in my experience, that is almost wholly confined to the lore. The actual story or narrative of the game as you play it, the story of your Tarnished, is a lacking one. Yes.
So I kind of agree and disagree with him to an extent, and he did use the qualifier like mostly, so I'm not going to like get really into it on that front where it's like, sure, there are certain elements of the storytelling that is a bit more oblique in regards to, I think, like Corrin and Goldmask trying to understand the fundamentals of the Golden Order. I think that is done very well if you have the wherewithal to actually be able to complete that quest, because it's not very straightforward at all, which I think could also speak to criticisms about Elden Ring specifically. So that does make it a bit more difficult to address, because a lot of the more nuanced things in Elden Ring's story / narrative / not lore is still kind of off the rails and off like the beaten path in terms of how it's presented to the players, perhaps. Yeah, Teen Sith, I agree. He should probably define what he means by narrative development before going into it. I think he did a pretty decent job, maybe not as clear as he could have been, by saying all of the things that are not lore. So I'm going to assume he's saying like things not like coming verbatim from item descriptions specifically. So probably things more like NPC dialogue and cutscenes and character-driven actions. Nothingness has always wondered about the lore of the item descriptions. Like, does the player character learn more about the world by attaining the items? I mean, to a certain degree, yes, because I'm trying to think of a good example of that. Like all of the merchant notes is that might be a little bit too straightforward. If they're like, "Hey, idiot, break the skulls on the wandering mausoleums," and they'll stop. Versus some other random things. But generally, I think you can come to the conclusion that the player character does learn more about the world through the items that it interacts with, which is very unintuitive. But to give like a more like concrete example of that, it's as soon as you give the younger D brother the armor that belonged to the elder, he comes back to life and he like learns what happened to his older brother and whatnot. So that kind of ties into it that way, perhaps. Necropolis's player character can't read. They just get the lore telepathically. So the example that I often give comes from Bloodborne, when you go into the Grand Cathedral and you place your hand upon like Lawrence's skull. You get that whole flashback with like Willem and Lawrence and Fear the Old Blood. I think that kind of idea is supposed to be like what the player character experiences when they come into contact with perhaps every item in the game, but it is arguable for sure. Hey Zero, welcome back to the stream. Sounds like he wants instant gratification. This is a Souls games. You're never told anything that's going on. Well, I think it's more nuanced than that, and I do think some players deserve a little bit more guidance if they want to think that this is like, if they want to argue that this is a best narrative to compete against other games. Yeah, item descriptions lean on the fourth wall a little bit, in your opinion. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a little bit of both. That the player character probably gains a little bit of knowledge, but it is unclear if the player character gains the same knowledge that we do as the player ourselves.
Your character is a blank slate to allow for character RPG expression, but the game doesn't let you express that outside of your combat playstyle. Your interactions with NPCs or even lots of the world is not impacted at all, and this leads the game's story progression to be pretty hollow. You are simply that which kills the big bads and maybe occasionally helps out an NPC with their one quest. Compare this to another blank slate RPG IP, the Fallout series, where you have the same blank slate, but your RPG investments and choices impact your relationships with NPCs, the kind of person you are, and how you can traverse the world. The story elements are adaptive to your role-playing, and there are still substantive narrative developments. I also take issue with the game's NPCs. Many of these characters have developed backstories, like Ronnie, Vike, and Iji, but their presence as characters with significant development or arcs is bare bones and lacking in the present game as you play through it. Like, what is...
Yeah, I fully agree with that, and that's just kind of been one of the weaknesses of FromSoft games in general, where each character kind of has an arc, but it's very, very small and very self-contained for the most part. And being self-contained isn't necessarily a problem. It's just like, one of my core criticisms about Elden Ring is just how freaking stupid the Tarnished is to not just be like, hey Ronnie, yo, what was that all about? Like, why'd you kill Godwin? Like, please, why? Why is our Tarnished so dumb and so, not inquisitive? It just kind of kills me.
Is the character development of Ronnie through the game, or even Melina? Do they change that much throughout the story from beginning to end? Do you see their progression? Melina and even Torrent would have been great cases to have been more involved and had more progression as characters, since they are always by our sides.
Yeah, all of the characters in FromSoft games are kind of remarkably flat, or they get flattened at the end of their endings, and it doesn't really matter what their quest goes through, because they don't really experience like a lot of character change. I think maybe like the biggest exception to that would be like Lucatiel, but even with that example, she's pretty straightforward in what she's going through, and it's just kind of a bit more touching and more humanizing than like a lot of the other NPC quests, I feel. You think a man tasked by God to kill people just doesn't give a damn about the world? Maybe. So yeah, I was kind of wondering to myself, like, with the category of best narrative, should that really just be like all of the things that are mandatory in the game, or should we include like side content? And also, how should we balance the two when like looking at the game's kind of, pseudo objectively here? Because you can more or less ignore all of the NPCs in Elden Ring and still like do the main quest, and there's really not a lot of story to accompany that at all. Whereas there's a hell of a lot more story going through a game like God of War or I don't remember, like Horizon Forbidden West perhaps, than Elden Ring. But even with that being said, Elden Ring still does like have a lot of cool elements incorporated into it in terms of like the characters' lack of total knowledge of the world, the way that they can kind of deceive you with like patches or Gustak. And despite all that, it's just still very bare bones at its core. There's not a lot of meat on the bones in terms of like the NPC interactions. They're just very straightforward and very, very formulaic at this point in FromSoft's history of game development. And that isn't necessarily like a bad thing, but it could still have been fleshed out a bit more. You really love the puzzle aspect of the game? Yeah. And so, not all players are going to engage with those kind of like puzzles, so I don't really fault them for that and preferring a game like God of War instead. And because so many players feel like that, I do think there is a larger kernel of truth to those kind of claims in general.
We could see them grow and change and develop as we grow through the world. There is a tiny bit of this with Melina disappearing and coming back and talking about her newfound resolve, but that basically just puts her in the same position as she was at the start of the game. Yes, there is some lore contextual development, but the actual experience of the character in the story is basically the same. That progression for either of them and a lot of the rest of the cast simply isn't there. And yeah, there are some.
And yeah, to go along with Melina, she only ever shows up when we sit at a few sites of grace throughout the world. We don't really get a strong understanding of her character. I mean, look at how many people are confused with like what happens at the end of the Frenzied Flame ending. And her sacrifice doesn't really feel like a sacrifice to most players, I would assume. It's just more like, oh, we lost this girl who just kind of shows up sometimes occasionally, but it's not like she was consistently with the player enough to feel that sense of loss feel more significant than some of the other kinds of losses in other games, perhaps. I would start like listing off titles, but I don't also want to like spoil things for people who don't know. They just want a vibe of inscrutable and stoic characters a little bit. Nothingness's favorite thing is the world building for them. Look at the whole ass mythology of these worlds. Yeah. So I really do enjoy the world building. Dark Souls 1 is my favorite in that regard. Elden Ring is not my favorite by quite a large margin, I think. Like Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne. I think I even like Dark Souls 3's world building more than Elden Ring, to be honest. Like, don't get me wrong, Elden Ring still has like a lot of cool stuff that I enjoy, but it just feels kind of disparate, probably due to its overwhelming size and simultaneous interconnectedness, yet not at the same time. Necropolis feels like Elden Ring lets you experience your own story, whereas God of War has more of a story of a vision that it wants you to see. So I kind of disagree with that because I feel like the story aspect of Elden Ring is inconsequential when you're just a murder hobo, and it's not like you're really interacting with like townsfolk, getting a feel of the lay of the land. It's just like every place is like every place else to a very large degree, with a few very, very, very few exceptions like Jarburg or whatnot. When I compare a game like Elden Ring to the most bland of RPGs, like the latest Star Ocean, there's a hell of a lot more flavor in the world just by interacting with NPCs and towns and villages and stuff like that than anything you really get in Elden Ring. So it's kind of rough for me to say like you experience your own story, Because I feel like even like vanilla WoW gives players like more of their own story creation with like how they interact with the world and the kind of lore in each area with the way that it builds up with their quests and stuff. Whereas Elden Ring, it's like you show up, you know you're going to genocide everything and then just roll on out to the next place you need to go. Tony Pepperoni, welcome back to the stream. You just think the animation of Melina sitting with us always occurring would have made a big difference? Maybe. I feel like if we had a better understanding of her character, so that way losing her felt more impactful to the player overall, would have helped its like narrative in showing off Melina's willingness to sacrifice herself for a vision of a better world. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Bella brings up a good point. We wish you had the Yharnam NPCs that you could talk to, like in Elden Ring, talking through doors, windows, letters, and notes. Yeah, that was one thing that I think really helped build up Bloodborne that's kind of easy to overlook, to be honest. Being able to always talk to Melina, maybe just have her make remarks about the surroundings, she would have felt more there. So yeah. Another good example, I think, of a way that a game makes kind of a narrative storytelling without it being like stuck to lore notes and stuff is in like Fallout 3 and, you know, all the Fallout games after that, is just having the radio and kind of being able to listen into the radio stations and kind of get a better feel of the world overall. Now, that doesn't mean like we had to have Melina do that, but I'm just saying like it does help characterize things a bit more as you go along, especially like when story starts to impact stuff relating to those lore developments. The funny thing is, if they forced everyone to talk to Melina and listen to the echoes everywhere, everyone would complain about railroading instead of the lack of story. True that. So you're a little bit damned if you do, damned if you don't. However, I would still say like the Melina stuff could have been more impactful if it was fleshed out a bit more.
Some cases of change, like with Bach or Roderica, but these again are just not that much. Bach's progression and complexity as a character pale in comparison to a lot of the characters in God of War, like Freya's. Most of the main characters in God of War feel much more deeply developed by the game than those in Elden Ring, and that really isn't that surprising when there's a lot more time spent with them and they have a lot more instances of dialogue. There's Roderica, who is a reference to Farnese in Berserk, but Farnese has a hugely more developed character arc. Sure, Berserk's a decades-old manga, but I'm just trying to make the point that if we judge the narrative of Elden Ring fairly, not handicapping it at all because it's just a video game, holding it to the same standard as we would any other work of art, I think the active narrative of Elden Ring is lacking. The game world, as I play through it, that's the important part, does not have very complex developing characters, nor a very compelling plot.
Yeah, I agree with that 100% right there.
Like, Hayata has a cool story and quest, but it really just isn't that developed. There isn't enough there, or time spent with her, or interactions, or dialogue, or actions on her part that make for a developed character like we see in any other kind of medium.
And I mean, to be fair, when you put your hand on Hayata and she got burned and then she died, was anybody surprised? I mean, they've done this kind of trope so often in FromSoft games that I feel like it's kind of lost its impact. Like, Hayata as Arena may have been a stronger pull because she seemed a lot more innocent to begin with, but with Arena dying and then Hayata like popping up out of nowhere, it kind of like implicitly set off alarm bells for me, so I couldn't really allow myself to get attached to this character. Nothingness was surprised. Oops, my fault. Necropolis was too. It was different than before. So maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm just jaded from previous FromSoft games. Corporate Nothing says character development paths. Sad, crazy, or both. Yep, there is no happy character development ending. Actually, Nefeli Lu kind of makes off like a bandit, all things considered, for a FromSoft game.
If we saw Hayata's story in another medium, I don't think she would come across as a very developed or interesting character because there isn't enough there. I think that's the case for a lot of people, myself often included, for Elden Ring. Now, of course, the game does have some narrative beats. You find your maiden dead, you team up with Melina, you get to the Erd Tree, get rejected, burn it all down, and defeat the boss gauntlet at the end. But these don't feel like a fleshed out story or journey for the player. there isn't a ton of narrative development going on throughout. Now, this is obviously kind of the point with the style of game FromSoft is making. Insert quote everybody's heard about Miyazaki reading English novels as a kid, not understanding part of it, and wanting to make us feel the same way playing these games. Sekiro did not have the same story issues to such a degree, but it also had a lack of the kind of lore so many people, myself included, really love in Elden Ring and other similar titles. Overall, I don't think this design approach is worse, though I do think the game would benefit from a stronger, more developed story and more dynamic characters. After all, those novels Miyazaki read had fully developed stories and characters. We always come to the characters and bosses in these games almost as relics. We read of their past accomplishments and feats, but the story almost always feels basically over by the time we arrive. Again, I get that this is partially the point, but a little bit of leaning into allowing the player to be more a part of that story, just sometimes, would be something I would find enjoyable. Basically, if we the players are like Miyazaki reading those English novels, give us just a little bit better understanding of the language. Instead of being an A1 or an A2 speaker, maybe sometimes let us be a B1 or a B2 speaker. I don't want Elden Ring or future From Software titles to be just like other mainstream releases, with all the plainly straightforward narratives. I appreciate the difference in difficulty, storytelling approach, and overall game experience. But at the same time, that doesn't mean I have to avoid all criticism, especially of something that might seem core to that approach.
So yeah, if we want to compare Elden Ring to other kind of open world games, I think, of course, Skyrim is a pretty decent comparison point in terms of how you have quests in different villages, which isn't like the main point right now. But what I do think is important is being able to ally oneself with like different factions or get different lenses through which you can look at the world to gain a better understanding of the world as a whole. Whereas Elden Ring doesn't have that very often. You have kind of glimpses at it with like Corrin and Goldmask, and a little bit with like the Volcano Manor, but nothing that holistic, which it doesn't have to have like different factions to compete against each other, but like Luigi was just saying, it always feels like we're just kind of at the end of a story that's already been written, and it doesn't really feel like, to me, we're making a large impression ourselves, despite going on to become like the Elden Lord and write the chapter of a new age. You miss Covenants? Yeah. Teen Sith says, they don't think this is worth comparing to a linear, carefully structured narrative. Like, this isn't a dismissal, you just find this specific framing to be a bit of a nothing burger. So, I don't think it's a nothing burger because it is being directly compared, to God of War, at least in the category of like the best narrative in the Game Awards. And I do think it is fair to a certain extent to say like, you shouldn't have to know all of the lore from the item descriptions to get to understand the narrative of the game. And for me personally, I would say narrative comes from things that aren't related to the lore. And it's kind of like the plot equals lore plus narrative, but yeah, they kind of all stand apart from each other, perhaps. Or maybe plot isn't the best answer. Maybe story is the best answer. I don't know. It's a little bit arguable, I suppose. Writing a new chapter of the world literally comes after the ending of the game, and we don't even really have any good hints as to what those endings entail, which I think also can speak as criticism against the narrative of the games. Drew Wing says, they think if you lost these fleshed out relatable characters, you'd lose the weird factor. All the NPCs are deeply, deeply weird. I don't know about that. Trying to think of like what would be FromSoft's like most complete NPC. I mean, Patches. And he's really weird. But I mean, you kind of understand what Patches is like if you played the other games too. Teen Sith says, they think of narrative as the entire package. The plot is what events are happening. The storytelling is how the plot is being woven together. So I would disagree with that because narrative means you need like the narrator. And while lore goes into it, lore stands separate. So I don't think narrative should encompass lore as well. But if you want to say like lore plus plot equals narrative, that's fine. To be fair, like the Game Awards did kind of have that element of the lore being able to be included into the game, like Elden Ring. But to be fair, I think one big failing of Elden Ring is that a lot of the descriptions are related to items, and a lot of these items are extremely rare to get, or maybe not extremely rare, but you really have to go out of your way to get some of these items. And I don't think it's fair to expect the average Joe to 100% complete the game and literally read every item to get a really good understanding of the lore. I mean, hell, I've read every item multiple times at this point, and even I don't really fully understand the lore, but I don't know. Sweet Xiaoqua is from his deepest character? That's interesting. Alright, going back to the video.
I think Elden Ring's story is pretty lackluster, but I don't think that it has to be to keep most or even all of the core features that demarcate the game as a special experience. It's easy to say that the game has a problem with boss reuse, but it's harder to genuinely say it has a problem with narrative, especially because there are so many others saying that who simply don't enjoy the overall game philosophy and are just using this as an excuse to attack the game. I don't want to change that philosophy, I just want a better story, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. All that said, I am happy with the nomination at the Game Awards. I think Elden Ring showcases fantastic storytelling, just mostly for stuff that happened before we start playing in the game world. We do get to experience the learning of that information as players, so it is very much still in-game storytelling, just of a different kind. And another YouTuber, the Lore Hunter, actually has a great video just released on that idea of finding the information and story as the player. You should really go check it out if any of this video has been interesting at all. So I'm excited to see what people think and how Elden Ring and God of War do at the awards in total. I haven't beaten God of War, but from what I've played, I think Elden Ring is still the better game in my opinion. I know, quite a surprise coming from the Elden Ring YouTuber. God of War is fun, but I don't think it does enough with its gameplay, and it really seems to segment gameplay and story as two separate things, which is not something I super like. Have cutscenes, sure, but some of the segments just seem to go a bit far for me. I may be streaming the Game Awards if I can get my internet to play nice, but either way, I will be making a video if a DLC announcement comes out. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have any thoughts on the subject, please leave them in the comments. I don't think I'll have another video out before Thanksgiving, so happy Thanksgiving to everyone. And if you don't celebrate that specific holiday, I wish you a happy fall harvest season and celebration of some sort. Thanks so much for watching, feel free to join my Discord in the description below, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.
Yeah, that is a good video by Madluigi. Let's go ahead and link this into the chat. Alright, so what was I going to say before I got distracted? Happy Thanksgiving, guys. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, I don't want to say like this is an issue with Elden Ring as much as it is like, as Teen Sith was saying before, I don't think it is fair to compare a game like God of War to Elden Ring in the sense that if I were to compare Elden Ring to another kind of like fiction, it almost feels like a choose your own adventure story where there's a lot of gaps left in for the player to fill in themselves, and the narrative or the lore of Elden Ring is kind of fundamentally broken in some ways when we don't even have a consensus on like when the Rune of Death was sealed or just removed from the Erd Tree, whatever you want to call it. Simple things like whether or not, like when Mikola and Melania were born on the timeline, when the Shattering technically occurred, or like the Night of the Black Knives. Obviously, for some of you guys, a lot of this stuff might sound very straightforward. However, these are topics that come up all the time in lore discussions. Like we were getting into these things earlier today on the Discord, ironically enough. So the way that I think players approach Elden Ring is they have like a base structure, and that base structure fills their headcanon, which is, I think, a pretty big divorce from the narrative of the game itself. Whereas these other games' narratives are probably what I would say to be more complete. Teenth Sith says they think Miyazaki has said choose your own adventure books were among the fantasy he read as a kid. Makes sense. Load headcanon, aim, fire. Yeah. So I think if I remember correctly, Elden Ring did win Best Narrative that year, and it actually shocked the hell out of me because I think it's kind of bad in a lot of ways. Elden Ring Best Narrative. Hot take. Deserves to win. This is annoying. Okay, so God of War won. Okay. So Elden Ring won. Okay, so I was misremembering. That makes sense to me. I'm not too familiar with the other games to say like what should have won, but I'm not surprised that Elden Ring didn't win. So I think I was just mostly surprised that it won like Best Art Direction, not because I think it was bad, but just because like other games have a better level of fidelity, as Crunchy would say, which is all well and good. You were shocked it didn't get music though? It won Design and Game of the Year. Okay. Thank you, guys. Teen Sith says, I think of what you call lore as more world building, which feeds back into the narrative. So it's complicated because, like, it's a game. It certainly does contribute to the story, but I don't think I would call it, like, narrative, perhaps in a more conventional source of the word. That's the wrong... I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like, no more conventional understanding of the word because, I feel like narratives are like more structured rather than just like a story, even though that is like technically the definition. I feel like the definition is kind of like evolving more over time as we get more abstract forms of storytelling with things like video games and stuff. But yeah. Classic Reddit hot take that 80% of people agree with. Yeah. Morlore says, something they really don't like about Elden Ring is that it seems like you show up after all the interesting stuff happens and you stop playing before all the interesting stuff starts up again. You might say that, but it feels like we're really interested in what happened with Godfrey, but maybe it was exactly the same as it happened with the Tarnished to a degree. So, but yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying, and that's kind of what Luigi was talking about as well in this video. Alright, so that was a good video by Madluigi. We've already linked it in the chat, so if you guys want to go ahead and give him a like and or a sub, please go ahead and do so, and tell him your spicy hot narrative decision takes in his video comments if you so desire. So next, we'll be moving on to Crunchy's video, the Elden Ring critique. And Crunchy was in the chat earlier. I don't know if he's lurking now, but now that we've got our little bit of spice flowing, let's see if Crunchy will continue to let it flow. And spoiler warning for Elden Ring and Shadow of the Colossus. I actually haven't seen or played Shadow of the Colossus. It's on my to-do list, my ever-growing, eternal to-do list. Maybe I'll get to it eventually. TM. Hey, Crunchy's still in the stream. Nice to have you again. So, Teen Sith says, they're not coming at it from the perspective of an audience member. You're looking at it this way because you write yourself. A non-linear story is still a story. I'm not disagreeing with that. It's that the presentation, I think, of a narrative is different than a non-linear story. When in a game like Elden Ring, that part of the narrative isn't... when it's optional, if that makes sense. So I feel like for a game like Elden Ring, the narrative that isn't optional is stuff that comes from like cutscenes and text, and arguably a little bit of NPC dialogue, whereas like you don't need to read an item description at all. I guess you could ignore like a lot of the NPCs, which is why I like mentioned it briefly earlier that I don't know how much it should be considered or disregarded, because I know like a lot of players don't delve into the lore of the item descriptions or even a lot of the NPCs. So does that make God of War's narrative a bit better because it is more on the rails? Maybe. I think it's arguable. Thanks, Astanex. If you unsub, just make sure you sub again at the end of the video when I make my further calls to actions. The narrative exists whether you pay attention or not. You are correct. All right, but anyway, moving on to the next one with Crunchy's Elden Ring critique.
Shadow of the Colossus.
I can't help but notice it because I've done it on a few of my videos, but the black border just shows he didn't zoom in as much as he needed to for this.
This could be described as a minimalist game. Most of the things you'd expect to find in an action-adventure game are missing. There's no combat, no inventory, no NPCs, and very little explicit narrative. Almost everything is stripped away, leaving just 16 puzzle bosses and a vast but empty world. The minimalist approach to Shadow of the Colossus sets it apart from most games, but being different doesn't automatically make something better. It's what it does with its limited content that makes it special. The minimalist design highlights a theme that permeates the game: contrast. Spacing out each Colossus fight between long stretches of relaxed open-world travel enhances the impact and drama of each battle. Each Colossus is arranged so that it contrasts with its neighbors, and the traveling sections in between similarly provide contrasting areas of the world to explore. Even the visual style is all about contrast. The desaturated colors and overexposed lighting draw attention to the contrast between light and shadow. Creative director Fumito Ueda has described his style as design by subtraction, an approach that sacrifices quantity in favor of a focused artistic vision. By limiting themselves to fewer mechanics, the team was able to give each one the attention it deserves, making the gameplay more engaging. By putting less in the world, they were able to focus on atmosphere and pacing, giving the world more character. And with less content in the game as a whole, they were able to arrange what remains in a contrasting and poignant aesthetic, making the overall experience more cohesive. To summarize, Shadow of the Colossus is a game that does more with less.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because I think one game that I would compare this to, probably a little bit unfairly, is like Breath of the Wild, whereas every little bit of footage that I've seen of Breath of the Wild hasn't been appealing to me because it kind of looks empty and lifeless. But ironically, Shadow of the Colossus there does look appealing to me because it looks empty and lifeless, but it seems like done intentionally so, whereas Zelda just doesn't give me those vibes at all. I think like the whole minimalist subtractive type vibes that they were going there for just kind of works to, I don't want to say like isolate the character or something like that, but it's kind of close to what I'm feeling. I just can't articulate it right now.
To summarize, Shadow of the Colossus is a game that does more with less. Elden Ring is a game with almost the exact opposite design philosophy. It's maximalist rather than minimalist. Building on the mechanics of the Soulsborne series, it throws in almost everything from the previous games and the kitchen sink into the mix. It's Dark Souls on steroids. Everything is bigger, more complicated, and there's more of it. Boss fights are more spectacular, combat options are more varied, and the world is easily the largest and most detailed FromSoft has ever conceived. In a sense, Elden Ring is a game that does more with more. Given the positive way I described the minimalist design of Shadow of the Colossus, that might sound like a thinly veiled criticism, but it's not. I want to make it clear before I continue that I think Elden Ring is a great game, one of the best to come out in many years. Even though it suffers in some areas, I can appreciate its ambitious vision. In keeping with its new open-world setting, Elden Ring's design is mainly oriented around exploration and player freedom.
Yeah, and I believe I've said this before, but if I haven't, I've definitely thought it before, that I think it's a hell of a lot easier to get an open world game the size and scope of Elden Ring wrong than it is to get it right. And it is kind of astounding of how much in Elden Ring they did get right. And obviously they could use a bit of tweaking here and there, but overall it is still a very quality product.
The maximalist approach is a logical fit for that theme. In the same way that a tougher challenge brings a greater sense of accomplishment, Elden Ring provides a wonderful sense of adventure that couldn't be achieved without the tremendous size and scope of the world. But despite the advantages of Elden Ring's maximalist design, it sometimes overreaches, especially as the game progresses, leaving the late game areas feeling shallow, stretched out, disconnected, and rushed. Lack of polish in the late game isn't new for
That's so funny, because I was literally about to stop it and bring up the dragon butts verbatim. Well done, Crunchy, my man. You have just successfully led me by the nose.
FromSoft. Every action RPG they've released has suffered from development crunch time, with late game areas often getting the short end of the stick. But the size of Elden Ring only exacerbates that problem. It's one thing if an area the size of Lost Izalith is unrefined, but when the late game is the size of Lordran itself, a substantial amount of time is spent in subpar levels. Broadly speaking, the journey through Elden Ring is focused on the Erd Tree. As you progress through the game, you'll get closer and closer until you finally arrive at its entrance. It's a monument which orients you throughout the game, both physically and in the narrative. So there's something odd about the fact that when you finally arrive at its base, you walk right past it and up a mountain, where you set it on fire from a distance. Then you fall asleep and wake up in a flying city even further away where you set it more on fire. Then you wake up again back in Lendel where there's nothing left except a boss rush to the end.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that I didn't think about it quite in that way. But I mean, obviously, like, narratively within the game, it kind of makes sense because, like, oh, you can't get into the Erd Tree. You gotta go up the mountain 15 miles both way in the snow there and back, you know. But no, that's a pretty good point that I'll probably be stealing in the future.
Theoretically, this change of pace could be a contrasting climax to the game, but it ends up feeling more haphazard, partly because of the disjointed map design. From the moment you set foot in Limgrave, the entire open world from Redmane Castle to Lendel can be traversed in contiguous, uninterrupted gameplay. But after beating Morgott, the map design becomes increasingly fragmented, with almost every late-game area only accessible by one entrance with a loading screen or cutscene. Mogwyn Palace and Deeproot Depths have two entrances each, but neither path can be traversed backwards, leaving these areas as disconnected from the open world as Roundtable hold.
True.
This might be only a minor issue, except that it's accentuated by the severe drop in enemy variety in these areas. Out of the Mountaintops of the Giants, Farum Azula, Consecrated Snowfield, the Halig Tree, the Sewers, Deeproot Depths, and Mogwyn Palace, the only new enemy that hasn't already appeared in some form is the Albinauric Archer, and they're far from the best of what the game has to offer.
Actually, you have deceased Albinauric archers in Liurnia. No, but in all seriousness, I agree there that once you get into the Forbidden Lands, every other part of the game feels extremely disconnected from everything else. Like, you literally get teleported into the Halig Tree, which is essentially the same as Farum Azula, and then you have to get teleported into the Mogwyn Dynasty Mausoleum, either through the portal here or with the silly little side quest with Vare and the Lord of Blood's Exaltation. So they do ultimately feel way more disconnected than any other part of the game. And they could have potentially, like, fixed that, by parts of it at least, by having alternate ways of accessing each area with maybe a teleporter in the Shifra area connect into the Mogwyn Dynasty Coliseum, maybe something with, like, the regal ancestor spirits or something along those lines, or just having, like, a tunnel appear somewhere. I don't know. Yeah, but these are really good points so far, Crunchy. Tea-Watered Houseplant says they think Farum Azula and Elphiel are good. It's just getting to them that's the issue. Yeah. And I do wish FromSoft did have the cojones to allow players to get to the final sections of the game at the very beginning. One thing that I would have absolutely loved is having like a teleporter place either somewhere in like the Stranded Graveyard or maybe even the Round Table Hold to give it more of a purpose. That would allow you to access like each area through a certain kind of waygate, whether or not they were like gated off by imbued stone sword keys or something else along those lines. Or even like the 4 belfries could have like teleported to more places like these areas, perhaps. You just found out about the secret path from Frenzied Flame Prescription to Deeproot Depths like a month ago. Yeah, so that part was really cool. I mean, it's still kind of really out of the way. It's kind of annoying to get to Deeproot Depths no matter which way you go. In some ways, I think Frenzied Flame Prescription is easier to fight like Moog and go through the Dan Lane Dell sewers than it is to deal with the 2 Valiant Gargoyles, but anyway. If they had unique designs for the waygates instead of the little circly boys, it would honestly go a long way to make it feel better. Yeah. You wish Vari's quest included talking to other Bloody Fingers like Volcano Manor would have been cool. Yeah, it's really weird that like Okina doesn't just attack us on site in the Radon Festival, but like Vari doesn't show up or anything like that. It would have been nice to have a little bit more of a robust cast, perhaps. What do you mean, just wrong warp from the Belfries, dude? Oh, you got me. I'm going down. It's all good, Teen Sith. The 4 Belfries being like a mini optional Demon Souls Nexus could have been cool, yeah. If they just had like a more of a Nexus type place. So this is one idea that I thought would be like super, super cool. I originally wanted the Ancient Dragons to come down from like where all the Fulgur blooms with the lightning and stuff. But maybe if they like opened it up to a sky world where you could just like fast travel between different points, or maybe not like fast travel, but like travel to different sections of the world through them, that could have been super cool too. Maybe having like a cloud fight, who knows? There's just a lot of potential to like really broaden Elden Ring's horizons that I can't really begrudge them for not making because of how large the game already was, but no matter what, like, imagination is going to always be like a little bit better than reality in some regards. Non sequitur, but why the heck is Okina in the Radon Festival? Because he's probably searching for death too, unironically. So he's a Shura, and he needs to get like an honorable battle in death, kind of like the White Reed Inaba, perhaps. You thought I said clown fight? Alright, going back to the video.
Unique enemies aren't just a way to shake up the combat. They also provide a unique character to each area. The mountaintops of the Giants is the most disappointing in this respect. Finding more of the same golems, demi-humans, bats, and skeletons that have been sprinkled copiously throughout the game isn't just disappointing mechanically, but also thematically.
And not only that, the area is just so damn empty. And so when you have an extremely empty, large area with very little enemy diversity that you haven't seen anywhere else, it just comes kind of oppressive, unfortunately.
Feels shallow. Even worse, it reuses the finger creepers, giant crayfish, and the giant crows and dogs, which had been doing for their respective areas what's missing from the mountaintops.
True, like the finger creepers all around Caria Manor, that was kind of a weird moment, but I was totally down with it because I'm like, oh man, this kind of reminds me of Landstalker or like Legend of Zelda when you'd have like these random hand dudes come down from the sky and like try to grab you. So that just kind of made sense because like Ronnie's a witch, Rykard's a Carian too. And then you get to the mountaintops and they're just kind of everywhere and it's like, oh, okay, I don't know what this is all about. And then the crayfish is really weird, especially because like you have the frozen river. Maybe there's more of a story there, but yeah, just kind of disappointing. Explain the Shura thing I just said. You thought Shura lives and kills for the thrill? So yeah, Moog offered Okina the path to become a Shura, essentially, but when you look at the Land of Reed set, maybe not like the basic one. Let me look it up for you guys. Oh yeah, maybe this is a translation thing. Give me one moment. Seppuku, Wakizashi. Okay, so the base set doesn't explain it, so let me look up White Reed. Okay, no, the English is pretty fine about it. Let me zoom this in for you guys as per usual. So, the Inaba traveled in pursuit of not only the master who abandoned them, but also proper deaths, won honorably through hard-fought combat. So, the Inaba are disciples of the great swordsman Okina, and Okina kind of turned his back on them because he's just kind of following the path of the blade. And I think Okina is kind of like Henrik in Bloodborne, where he's just such a badass that he challenges everybody, but everybody dies. So he's just kind of following that path of the sword, and he needs to die in combat because he's a warrior, you know? So Inaba are following him, and they seek proper deaths, won honorably through hard-fought combat. To be a White Reed is to seek death, fitting for the Inaba, who desired nothing more than to die by the sword. So I think this design philosophy extends to Okina. At the very least, the Okina that existed before he got, like, corrupted, or maybe enticed is the better word, by Moog's proposal. Why does the Leonine Misbegotten have Radigan's wedding sword? Does Okina show up at the festival after invading in the mountaintops? I would need to double check that, because I typically do the Radon stuff before that, but maybe that's something worth looking into. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised if he does, because I'm pretty sure the Okina that invades us is still a Red Spirit invader. What's going on with the Zamor guys? Oh yeah, I guess those dudes are technically kind of unique, but you can already fight one in like a random Everjail, if I'm remembering correctly. Teen Sith doesn't mind the emptiness. It's honestly sort of nice to not have 5,000 things to do in a region. Enemy variety is definitely lacking. So I don't necessarily mind the emptiness, but it's just like compiled upon having a bunch of like smaller things to do in the dungeons and everything being extremely repetitive and formulaic. By this point in the game, makes this area kind of suffer if you've explored a lot of everything else. Maybe it's better for people who rushed through the game, but I did not have that experience, at least. Would Moog have sent Okina to kill Radon so he won't be a threat? I don't necessarily know. I don't know how much Moog would actually control the fingers. I think he just wants blood and lets them do what they please. But good question.
Sullying the uniqueness of those locations retroactively. The repetition of enemies is mirrored in the bosses as well. There are 168 boss fights in Elden Ring, but only 13 of these are completely unique, not being reused for another boss fight or standard enemy. Reusing minor bosses or field bosses is a reasonable concession for the size of the map, and can even sometimes help provide a feeling of progression. But repeating major bosses like Moog and Godric detracts from the unique experience of fighting those characters.
That's not Godric, that's Godfroy, man. Totally different.
Even optional bosses with unique designs, like Estelle or the Ancestral Spirit, suffer from repetition. The special novelty of the experience becomes familiar and predictable. The first time you fight a giant dragon, it's very dramatic, but by the 30th time, it starts to lose some of its luster. FromSoft might have had more time to create unique boss fights if they weren't so obsessed with making each one as long and complicated as possible. Ever since the DLC to Dark Souls 1, the series has increasingly leaned on the action elements of its boss fights, giving bosses more and more unique moves and combos. But quantity isn't the same thing as depth. More attack animations doesn't translate to more complex gameplay if the strategy for each attack is the same.
So yeah, I agree with that, and I think Renala is one of the most tragic bosses in all of Elden Ring, and maybe even like all FromSoft games, and not just from like a storytelling standpoint, but just in terms of like her actual mechanical boss fight. There's so much that goes into it to make it a great fight, but it's just kind of lackluster all around and very disappointing because of that. So I didn't notice this at first because the way that the sound is balanced in Elden Ring is kind of really bad, to be honest. But in Renala's boss fight specifically, the child that is chanting Renala's like aura and keeping it up, you can actually hear that one singing, and you'll be able to pinpoint it just by hearing it alone. So there's a lot of audio cues that go into it. When you break Renala's shell, all of the like little scholars will start singing to try to revive it, and there's a lot of really intricate pieces that kind of weave together to make it a really good design, but maybe not a compelling fight in terms of like difficulty, especially after bosses like Moog, or not Moog, but like Margit, not Godwin, wow, all these damn names. Between Margit and Godfroy, essentially, Godric, there we go. And even the Tree Sentinel, to a certain degree, is like a real spike in difficulty. Renala's fight is the best because you can punch children in the face. Okay. It's kind of like fighting Sif, but in reverse. Yeah, Sif, that fight actually hurts the soul a little bit.
Learn the timing of the animation, dodge at the right moment, and attack when you have an opening. Dark Souls created an atmosphere of anxiety around many of its boss fights, and it punished players who succumbed to that effect. Panicking would usually get you killed, but if you kept a cool head, paid attention, and thought strategically, the boss would be easily defeated. Dark Souls primarily challenged players psychologically, but the barrier to victory in the successive titles has increasingly relied on rote memorization and Twitch gameplay. Neither of those things require much deep thought or planning from the player. Memorization doesn't test intelligence or observation, but rather your ability to repeatedly bang your head against the wall. To shake this up, Elden Ring's enemies can now change attacks in the middle of a combo, but if anything, this makes the gameplay even more shallow. It encourages this style of play that's less strategic and more reaction-based. Twitch gameplay is filled with...
I don't know if that's more shallow, but I do understand where you're coming from with that. Just thinking about Elden Ring more broadly in the entire gaming spectrum, like one idea that I've had for a kind of open world game is kind of related to Mega Man X, where defeating a boss could affect other bosses and stuff like that. Maybe Elden Ring could have benefited from having a kind of system similar to that, where like beating one boss will make another boss weaker, or you have the tool to like more easily deal with that boss. Obviously, that kind of goes against a lot of Elden Ring's core design philosophy of making the player freedom like forefront in the game. So maybe that's kind of like a wrong way to think about things there, but I don't know.
With more adrenaline, but whatever extra tension this adds has been counteracted by the simultaneous trend in boss fights towards becoming bloated battles of attrition. The awesome spectacle of these fights can't hide the fact that in terms of gameplay, most bosses are little more than dressed up bullet sponges that overstay their welcome, and that bloat only becomes more pronounced with the excessive repetition of boss fights. Repetition of enemies and bosses might be more palatable if they were all polished and well designed, but the game seems to almost deliberately choose to repeat its worst enemies the most. Rune bears are one of the most embarrassingly broken enemies that FromSoft has ever designed, but they're still placed in almost every area of the game. Ulcerated tree spirits cause flashbacks to the incomprehensible visual design and animations of Bloodborne's worst enemies. The way they constantly clip through every surface at least means that more of that visual mess is hidden, but despite the issue with clipping, 5 of them are placed in small stone rooms, as if to make absolutely sure any sense of believability is gone.
Honestly, I mean, these things kind of remind me of fighting something like the Stray Demon or even like the Demon Fire Sage in Dark Souls 1, not the remastered version, just because you couldn't see the AoE on their attacks, so you didn't know how far you needed to be away from them. So that's kind of what it feels like fighting an ulcerated tree spirit, because it's a little bit disorienting trying to know what range you need to be at to hit them sometimes versus when they can hit you based off of what attack. So I know like other content creators like Dang It Jim with his defensive market might give Crunchy like a lot of criticism for these claims, but I do think there is still a large kernel of truth that Elden Ring's bosses do feel especially more sloppy in comparison to the previous games, and I think that the reason for that is they really intended on players relying on the crutch of having spirit summons, which is I think is both like a good and a bad thing, but probably more a bad thing that a lot of these bosses don't feel as good to fight one-on-one to me, which isn't to say like you can't do it, thinking back on like Dang It Jim's defensive market video, but at the very least it's unintuitive the way a lot of these bosses can combo their attacks, and unintuitive I think to expect most players to truly effectively cycle through their consumables and spells to stay on the offensive and keep bosses on the heels of their feet when most players aren't going to know their patterns of attacks until they're extremely familiar with the game. So, Otoako, welcome in. You can treat most of the game until endgame that way by using a plain weapon and infusing it with incantations or spells to take advantage of weaknesses. To a certain extent, although, yeah, I don't want to like fully rely on that idea because the game that I described is just fundamentally not Elden Ring. It's a different game. Tony says, you think expanding on Nepheli's quest and dealing with the power vacuums we leave would have been cool? Yeah. Tree spirits are the only boss you can keep a shield up on just because you can't read them. Oh, the only boss you do keep a shield up on? Understandable. Rune Bears killed a Let's Player Ponyboy was watching by smashing them literally into the floor. They no-clipped and died. Or was it the bear that no-clipped and died? You can't remember. I think something like that kind of happened to me somewhat recently. But I can't remember exactly what I did. I was just like really surprised at how it happened. You don't need good reaction time if you spam jump attacks with the Power Stance Ultra Greatsword. It depends, because not all enemies like get completely staggered by that. But I mean, it certainly does do wonders. Nectarine says, people always say the game is built around summons, but you just don't see it. Trading aggro while hitting the boss in the butt isn't satisfying. So why do you think that the game isn't built around summons? Because I feel like not every boss is like that, but a few like Margit and Malekith as Geraint definitely kind of feel that way to me, just because their combos can feel a bit oppressive. And of course, these bosses can be beaten one-on-one. I just feel like a lot of these bosses really flow better if they're able to switch their aggression to somebody else, because they don't give players a lot of time to heal or even counterattack after like a boss does like an 8 attack combo chain. You can only hit them once. It's kind of a very frustrating compared to like some of their other ones. So like for me, I really like the Moog fight. I think the Radigan fight is excellent and just really tarnished, pun intended, by having the Elden Beast attached to it. Godfrey, I think, is really, really good for a one-on-one fight. So it's not like all the bosses, it's just certain ones in particular. You're convinced the tree spirits are Miyazaki's favorite? Bosses in this game are crazy aggressive, and summoning makes them less frustrating to fight. Okay. You don't think the game is built around summons because summons completely break most fights? I think you're correct, and you're also incorrect in that I don't think the devs expected literally all players to just spam the hell out of the mimic tiers and teach specifically. So I think if you use something more along the lines of like the spirit jellyfish, the skeletal militia, or even like Oleg or Ingval, it'll probably be fairer, and they aren't complete like pub stomps. Not all summons are built equal for every boss fight. Yeah. The aggro pull is enough. That's kind of how I feel. Like, even though like the spirit jellyfish doesn't do a lot for combat, just having that extra second to breathe or get an extra attack on the back when they're in the middle of their combo, I think goes a long way. Great shield guys are the strongest. Nothingness says, they'd argue most bosses not reacting to you meaningfully takes levels of authenticity away from them. You trade twitchy gameplay to a boss that feels like it's fighting consciously. So yeah, I think there's levels to it, which is why I think Moog is a good character to fight against, even though like a couple of his attacks were a little bit annoying with like the blood flame spray. He has some really delayed attacks, really deceptive range, which is infuriating, but I also really enjoy. But yeah. Okay, lots of a good spicy discussion in the chat. Let's go back to the video though.
Other questionable enemy designs include the Deathbirds, Red Wolves, Gargoyles, Bloodhound Knights, Banished Knights, Pages, Falling Star Beasts, Godskin Nobles, Revenants, Grafted Scions, Ancestral Follower Archers, and Bell-Bearing Hunters, all of which the game can't seem to get enough of. Broadly speaking, these enemies are all characterized by unintuitive ways of moving, badly telegraphed attack animations, constant aggression, and abrupt poise-breaking attacks that deal massive damage.
So, man, the one thing that I did want to mention before that I forgot about is that when we did have repeating bosses become enemies in previous games, I felt like they made a little bit more sense to the story. Because at least in Dark Souls 1, we're told that the Taurus Demon and the Capra Demon came from below. So it kind of makes a little bit more sense that we fight more Taurus Demons and Capra Demons later on. I kind of even forgot that the Capra Demon is technically like a boss, and it's just a Capra Demon in Undead Berg's lower portion, because the dudes down in Lost Isolate just kind of feel like normal enemies, and it feels like the dogs are more the boss than the Capra Demon, but the arena's the boss, really. Let's be real there. And so the Taurus Demon is just like another good example of a reused enemy that kind of makes sense for that story there. So Elden Ring, I feel like in comparison to DS1, suffers on that part because we don't have a lot of connection with where these bosses end up when they're reused. Like the Fair Missoula Beastman, I could totally see him being arguably in a couple places. A couple of the Crucible Knights, okay, but then why do we have so many like in random spots around the world? Like the Everjail plus Shifra, plus like the Oriza Hero Grave with the dual set of them, the random Crucible Knight in the Rodan, Redmane, like Plaza area. That's kind of a bit much with the Leonine Misbegotten. The Leonine Misbegotten reused in Castle Morn with Radigan's Greatsword in the Snowfield and Redmane Castle. And also just they become random enemies throughout the world. They could use a bit more setting up in Elden Ring for sure. Bloodhound Knights are good though. I actually do like Bloodhound Knights. I don't mind their inclusion because I think the only kind of really iffy one to me is in the Crystal Cave right before Latenna. It felt like it would have been better to have like a Gideon affiliate in front of the Latenna thing rather than a Bloodhound Knight. Could any of the Crucible Knights be explained away as being tarnished? Unfortunately not, because they are not susceptible to a variety of status effects, including Frenzy, Deathblight, and even Bleed. Oriza Hero Grave is almost the Godskin duo, but nobody goes there unless they have to. Yeah. So, yeah, just imagine if they were not optional. Yeah, I feel like the Bloodhound Knight outside in Ray Lucaria does kind of make sense, because at least we do have the Carian affiliation with Rani, and we also have a random Bloodhound Knights by Eternal Darkness in Celia. So I can see them showing up in those places, but the Crystal Cave with Latenna, it might make sense, but it just feels a little bit too disconnected to me at least.
That weren't bad enough, repeat bosses are often given a friend to shake up the format.
Oh yeah, and I didn't get back to what Crunchy said right here. Let me rewatch it. Oh yeah, the telegraphed attacks. Okay, yeah. So Elden Ring does suffer because I feel like they were trying to keep veterans on their toes, which is totally understandable, with like a lot of really weird delayed attacks, and it becomes aggravating because the game teaches you to not react to enemy movement, but it punishes you if you don't. So to say that in a couple different ways, like there are times when an enemy starts an animation and you want to roll away because they're going to do that animation, and then there are times they delay it and punish you for doing what was the kind of quote-unquote correct thing to do. So it feels a little bit doubly punishing, which on one hand, I really appreciate that because like feinting and baiting out enemy dodges is a legitimate part of combat. So I kind of like the realism with that, but it does feel a little bit tuned up in Elden Ring than even compared to Dark Souls 3 with a lot of its delayed attacks. There's a Bloodhound Knight in the walls of Volcano Manor. What's his problem? I mean, he's a follower of Rykard. If it's Carrion affiliated, that one doesn't really bother me. He's Rykard's dessert, yeah. Elden Ring is trying to be easy for newbies, but also challenging for veterans. And boy, sometimes does that not work well. Totally agreed, Scaleezy.
If that weren't bad enough, repeat bosses are often given a friend to shake up the format. If you didn't enjoy fighting one ulcerated tree spirit, maybe you'd enjoy fighting 3. If one Crystallian was boring, why not add a couple and give them all the ability to inflict rot? If a single watchdog is too easy, why not add 4 or 5 imps to stagger you, in a setup eerily reminiscent of Dark Souls 2 spam bushes? In almost all cases, the mild disappointment of...
And I know this is like a legitimate counterpoint, but I also find it infuriating to a small degree when people do it, is when they say like, oh, well, actually, this fight isn't bad because you can just use the glintstone darts on the small imps so that they attack each other, which is true, but I think the game also doesn't set up these mechanics well enough to make that knowledge stick out in players' mind to kind of navigate these situations that they're put into. The multi-unit fights are what remind you of Aikido the most. A single watchdog is most certainly not too easy. Oh yeah, and then they commit the cardinal sin of just having these become like random enemies in later Chalice dungeons. And the snowfields are painfield. Well, anyway, English.
Simple repetition would have been preferable to this lazy attempt at adding surface-level variety. Maybe I'm being a little harsh. Elden Ring is a really big game, and most players probably aren't going to explore every single nook and cranny, especially on a first playthrough.
So, sorry to keep pausing every 2 seconds. Yeah, I think Crunchy does kind of bring up an interesting point. Like, if you put a burial watchdog at the end of every catacomb, it might become a little bit formulaic, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think if they did a couple things to like spruce them up, whether or not it's like a palette swap and giving them a couple different attacks, because it is nice that we have like the ice burial watchdogs, except for the fact that they're burial watchdogs and they're all terrible, you know. But one thing that I think is really good in terms of Elden Ring's enemy variety is just how they repurposed the very basic soldiers and knights for each area. Obviously, I feel like the Haligtree ones are a bit overtuned, and I do wish there was a little bit more of a equivalent power given to each area's demigod fighters, but I was very pleasantly surprised by those enemies overall.
You could try and defend the repetition of bosses by arguing that it gives most players a chance to experience these encounters regardless of where their path through the game takes them. But this would be a shift in FromSoft's design philosophy from previous games. The Soulsborne games have never been afraid to hide things where only exceptionally thorough players will find them, but that curiosity is generally rewarded with a unique experience. The smaller scale of Demon Souls or Dark Souls made exploring every nook and cranny feasible, but also fulfilling, and the same can't be said equally of Elden Ring. As the game progresses, diversions off the critical path become less and less attractive, because you already know what to expect. Another cave or catacomb with the same enemies, the same bosses, the same layout, and the same treasure.
They're slightly different, but yeah, I agree with what he's saying. Towards the end of the game, once I figured out the gimmicks of the catacombs, I was like, okay, there is this ramp here. That means there's either an invisible wall here or behind the stairs. So they definitely kind of wore their welcome. And I was actually really annoyed that only in the Consecrated Snowfield did they really start to vary up the mine design with the ice mines, but just like the layouts of those mines specifically. I just wish there was more diversity in the catacombs and the mines in general, or even caves. Scumnut beat the game with the infant skull. There's hardly only one option for fights, any of them. We're not trying to say that. It's just that, like, depending on how you played the previous games, I feel like a lot of these fights aren't quite as satisfactory in comparison. And part of the issue of, like, the satisfaction comes to, like, the heavily reused amount of bosses. Painfield works, yeah.
The late game seems almost intentionally designed to tell players, stop exploring so much and just finish the damn game already. This gets to the heart of Elden Ring's biggest problem with the design of its open world. Exploring a little is extremely rewarding, but exploring too much often diminishes what you've already experienced.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy for me to sit back and criticize a game as massive and ambitious as Elden Ring for its lack of variety, and much harder to actually solve that problem. To create a single enemy, it has to have a model and animations, hitboxes, textures, sound effects, AI, and when everything's done, it has to be thoroughly tested for balance and to make sure there are no bugs. A lot of work goes into every detail of a game like this. No matter how much a game has, it's always possible to ask for more, but many of Elden Ring's issues could be improved just as easily by subtraction as they could by addition. Imagine if, instead of being...
Hey Crunchy, if you were listening in chat, was that your first playthrough to kill the grafted scion? Did you just keep reloading like I did, or is this like on playthrough 2? Doesn't really matter, I'm just curious because I noticed as like a fresh character. Game is too big, simple as. Yeah, I'm really curious as to where Crunchy's going to go with the argument by subtraction, because I kind of forgot about the Shadow of the Colossus stuff at the beginning, partially because of how much we're talking about it. You beat him your first... No, I'm not saying, like, did you beat him your first time? I'm asking, like, whether or not you just, like, kept reloading and starting the game over. Because that's what I did. Because I was too stubborn, because I'm like, hey, Dark Souls 1 gave us the really cool Demon Souls, or, like, Demon Hammer, so I was, like, wondering what items we could potentially get from this thing. And also, I didn't feel like being its chump, so I just kept reloading.
as easily
you
by
reloaded? Okay.
as they could by addition.
So did you like kill this thing first before going through the game? That's kind of what I'm asking. Or was this like on a second playthrough?
Of Elden Ring's issues could be improved just as easily by subtraction as they could by addition. Imagine if, instead of being filled with repeat appearances of the giant crows and dogs and finger creepers, the mountaintops had no enemies whatsoever. On the surface, this might be less mechanically engaging, but it would give the area a unique character that it currently lacks, doubling down on atmosphere over repetitive gameplay. This would also allow the developers to reallocate their time and effort towards fleshing out other underdeveloped areas, like Shifa River or Consecrated Snowfield. Another aspect of the game which could have benefited from subtraction is the music. Elden Ring's boss music is generally well written, well produced, and exciting, but it's also all very similar sounding. Ever since Dark Souls 2, the FromSoft RPGs have become increasingly obsessed with the distinctive soul sound, a full orchestra with choir and church bells playing together in a disturbing quasi-medieval cacophony.
That's a good way to say it, and that's kind of how I felt for a long time as well. I really liked a lot of Dark Souls 1's OST because there's a little bit more variation. Obviously, not a lot of songs in any of their games, but I feel like Demon Souls is the most robust in terms of like its sound palette here. And DS2, it does have like a few different tracks. I actually do use like a decent amount of Dark Souls 2's music for like my videos because it has a couple more mellow songs. Dark Souls 3 is a lot worse, and Sekiro is a little just too like ambient to really get into for me. So yeah, that was Crunchy's 4th or 5th playthrough where he defeated the grafted scion, and you wanted to do it because you never had. Totally understandable. Yeah, we were talking about it a couple weeks ago on the Discord that Yuka Kitamura had like left FromSoft. I don't know if anybody in chat has been like keeping up with that. And so like Crunchy and I were like, all right, we could do with a little bit of differences here. Majula Magic's Divine makes you want to sit down and watch the world turn. Metalfinger says, you think a Stonefang tunnel style region that just has one huge mine with higher level smithing stones, the deeper you go, would have been preferable to running around looking for mines in every area? Yeah. My solution to that would be like having the nomadic merchants sell a certain quantity of the mines for or the stones for each area. So that way you're not just like completely stuck. Or even if you could like downgrade some of the stones, that would have been tremendously helpful for me. Because my first playthrough, I went from Limgrave to Weeping Peninsula / Caelid, and then, well, I guess technically I did like Stormvale. I saw Blythe. He told me to go find EG. So then I went up to Liurnia. I didn't find EG, and I didn't find the mine. No, I think I found EG, but I didn't go to the mines to get like the bell bearing, and I didn't go through the Limgrave mine originally. So then I came back down, went to Weeping Peninsula, went back to Caelid after I got teleported like immediately, and then I screwed around a lot in Caelid, went to the Divine Tower, got my ass handed to me by the Godskin Apostle, but I eventually killed it at like level 40, got the Greatsword, and then after I was done with that, I went back to Liurnia, found the mine, got the Somber Bell, and then I was finally able to upgrade my weapon from +2 to +14. So that was it was a world of difference between the way that I was fighting enemies with a +2 weapon versus a +14 one. So they could have eased up the scaling, the curve, if that makes sense. Okay. Ludwig's music hard carried the fight. Nobody talks about how fun he is mechanically. I do both. I super praise the Ludwig theme as well as the mechanics of that fight, especially like the transition between the styles of phase 1 to phase 2 and how he punishes panic rolling. But for what it's worth, Kitamura did not compose Ludwig's theme, so do with that info what you will. Yeah, Ludwig was composed by another author or composer. All right. Going back to Crunchy's video.
A Gregorian chant on meth. But that's a glib parody of the highly contrasting music of Dark Souls and Demon Souls. Those games were bombastic and dissonant at times, but many of the tracks cut down on instruments and intensity to give bosses a distinct character, like Nito, Gwendolyn, or Maiden Estrella. It's worth pointing out that the most memorable track from the entire series is played on just 2 pianos. Loud, aggressive music is only effective when contrasted against more intimate music. If every track is equally dramatic, none of them are special.
Very, very well said. And also good point about the Gwyn fight just being played on 2 pianos. Like everybody like memes with plin plin plon, but everybody knows plin plin plon. Or plin plin plon, you know.
Almost every individual boss track in Elden Ring would stand out as exceptional in Dark Souls or Demon Souls, but together as a whole, the similar orchestration and intensity of these tracks dilutes the impact of any one in particular. A few exceptions stand out: Renala, the Elden Beast, and the Ancestral Spirit, for example, but the vast majority of these tracks are essentially interchangeable.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting point about... Well, they were literally interchangeable. I think that's the next point you're going to bring up. I was going to say, I did like the Rykard theme, especially like the second phase transition portion, but I think right now you might just be talking about boss music and I might have forgotten like your actual transition, but I was going to say that I really do enjoy a lot of the more atmospheric themes for the games. Like Caelid to me is like S tier in terms of the way it just characterizes that entire region. I am glad that they actually added in night music to each region, but I also do wish they had a couple variations, maybe to go along with weather or something like that. Kinman, welcome back to the stream as well. Now we've got Crunchy getting the entire chat into pitchforks about the soundtrack.
In fact, FromSoft also seemed to think so when they switched the music for Melania and Morgott in the Day 1 patch. Some of the tracks play with the idea of doing something different, like using the organ for Fortisax or the harpsichord for Moog, but in a way this lip service is almost more disappointing. The few tracks which begin in an unusual way are almost always instantly drowned out by the all-too-familiar sound of a wailing choir riding a bed of string staccato and percussion punctuation. It's as if any attempt to be unique is repressed by the need to highlight the spectacle of the boss fight above anything else.
Yeah.
Despite the sameness of many boss tracks, at least they all enhance the experience, which is more than I can say for most of the ambient music. Sekiro was the first to introduce consistent ambient music outside of combat to keep up the tension, which made sense for its action-focused gameplay, but otherwise the FromSoft games have avoided ambient music for a good reason. Most video game music is non-diegetic, which means it isn't happening in the game's world, so removing it allows players to get more immersed in the diegetic sounds of that world. Elden Ring abandons that idea, instead filling the world with ambient music tracks. At their best, these tracks add character to each individual area, like in Lendel or Redmane Castle, but even these become tiresome after hearing each short track looped over and over again.
True.
Stepping into Limgrave for the first time is a magical experience, and the music adds to the emotional impact of taking in this gorgeous view. But after spending 20 plus hours exploring Limgrave, this 3-minute track will have played hundreds and hundreds of times,
Very
turning the
true.
music into something more annoying than atmospheric.
Which kind of goes back into what I said earlier in the stream about how like Fallout with its radio, I think does a lot to help drive the narrative of the game. Not in terms of just like giving us story, like info about the world, but in as well as like breaking up the feel of everything by having a lot of variation as to like what you're listening to. So subliminally in your mind, you might associate different areas of Fallout with like different songs that were playing in the style. So I do think Crunchy brings up a good point that these tracks, while not necessarily bad, they get looped for so long that they become very tiring, which I totally agree with there.
This is especially true of the tracks with more piercing timbres or obtrusive dissonances, like in Liurnia or Stormvale. Even where the ambient music is more effective in Lendel, it makes no sense to keep the same music once the city has been covered in ash. The intended emotional impact of exploring ash in Lendel is completely different from your first time through it. So
I wonder if Ash and Lendel would be better without music at all, because that would add a lot of like a feeling of finality to the area, perhaps. Never thought about that. That's I mean, even though you didn't say that specifically, Crunchy, just kind of thinking about this in general. I appreciate the attention here.
So using the same distinctive music just seems thoughtless. Overall, the decision to use ambient music was debatable at best. Whatever it adds in atmosphere, it loses something in immersion by covering up the natural sounds of the world. And Elden Ring's considerable playtime makes even the best tracks boring and repetitive. But ambient music is only one way Elden Ring's open world falls short. One of the new mechanics added to accommodate the open world is flask regain. Defeating a complete group of enemies grants a few additional flask usages. In theory, this both aids immersion by allowing players more uninterrupted gameplay, and adds depth to the open world by asking players, is the reward of a few extra flasks worth the risk, or will I lose more in the fight than I hope to gain? Unfortunately, both of these advantages are completely undercut by the ridiculous number of checkpoints in the open world.
I think even beyond checkpoints, the advantage of these are really overshadowed by how quickly you can avoid everything with Torrent. So certainly the checkpoints might be a little bit too numerous, especially in consideration of how few NPCs you kind of meet around these worlds. So maybe I think Elden Ring could have improved from having like less checkpoints, but more interesting, maybe not like hub areas, but just like focal points in each region. So like things like the gate in front of Stormvale, maybe like with Bach that could be cool, or maybe like another NPC around here that like talks about these dudes. Things like the Frenzy Flame Village, not like Frenzy Flame Village, but like the Ailing Village in Weeping Peninsula. Or just having like more stuff going on throughout the world in specific spots, perhaps. More lore agrees there are way too many graces. Good example is the one outside of Millennia's boss room. Yes, you generally like that one to be gone, along with many others. My knee-jerk reaction to that would be like, no, I like that grace there because it's right next to the boss room. But to be fair, they do add like Stakes of America everywhere, so I guess you don't necessarily need that one there. I'll say having so many graces has definitely been nice for somebody like me who's gone back to get like a ton of screenshots of every area in the game, or gone back for like more footage for lore videos and stuff like that. So a little bit of a blessing and a curse, perhaps. Oh, you'll get to torrent? Okay, yeah. You wish we got to make our own graces. That would be really cool. Yeah. Oh man, that could have been such a good idea because then you could have incentivized players to go out and explore things and meaningfully reward them, and that would be kind of their choice about where they wanted to put their sites of grace, and they could feel more like campfires. That would have been a really, really good idea. If you don't mind that, I'm totally going to steal that when I make my Elden Ring review idea. Necropolis. If I forget to credit you, I apologize. You like your Steaks of America? Well done. What about medium rare? Why did they make the elevator? Useless elevator. Probably to not have so much other random stuff get loaded in for the boss fight. DS3 actually suggested that in pre-production. It's a lot easier said than done, and for DS3 I don't think it would have been the right move because it's such a linear game, but I think for Elden Ring that would have been super freaking cool. It would make different playthroughs feel more distinct too. That's another good point. Yeah. There's a lot you could do with that. Okay.
Sites of Lost Grace are mechanically the same as the bonfires from Dark Souls, but the overly generous helping of them in Elden Ring completely contradicts the purpose of this mechanic. In Dark Souls, bonfires broke up levels into sizable chunks that forced players to carefully consider each drink of Estus and plan accordingly. After my first couple hours of playing Elden Ring, I never once had to think about the costs and benefits of drinking a flask in the open world, because a grace was always bound to appear before I was even remotely close to empty. It's interesting to me that so few people have complained about the number of graces. When Dark Souls 2 and 3 came out, there was a fair amount of backlash from the community about the unnecessary addition of copious bonfires, some of which were so close to each other that there were only a couple enemies or less in between. People argue
I think one reason people don't complain about the graces is because it becomes really tedious to not fast travel between places, just because like the level design is very empty and they don't funnel players into points of conflict where torrent becomes a non-viable option. But I get what you're saying here, though.
That this defeats the purpose of bonfires, which it does, but the community has been relatively silent about Elden Ring, which exaggerates this problem to ridiculous proportions. For all the fuss about difficulty and easy modes in these games, Elden Ring's open world is essentially designed in easy mode, because the cost-benefit analysis of using flasks is close to zero. More than half of them could have easily been removed, and this might have also facilitated the clarity of NPC quest lines, because players would be expected to congregate in fewer places. The number of graces, along with the ability to warp from the start, also means that players are incentivized to fast travel all the time, breaking up what should be uninterrupted gameplay into a series of loading screens. Despite the problems with the overabundance of checkpoints, the worst damage done to the open world by far is the inclusion of torrent, and it's bad enough that I feel confident saying the game would be vastly improved if he was deleted entirely. If you're attached to torrent, you probably disagree, but I'd ask why you're attached to him in the first place.
I don't know if the world would be better because it's still very empty and you would just need to go a lot further out of your way to avoid enemies, and I think that would kind of lead back into the Sekiro problem where stealth is just so much more overpowered than anything else that you kind of get incentivized into avoiding enemies entirely if you're not like looking for something specific. Everybody's saying, okay, no, what the fudge? In Elden Ring, you could always just walk away, which puts the onus on the player to explore things. True. At least with like the torrent angle, I feel like they needed to include him, or felt the need to include him, just because like traversal on foot is too slow otherwise for as large of a game as it is. Torrent made a lot of unbearable bosses feel bearable too. Yeah, and that might have also just been like they wanted Torrent so that way they could include mounted combat, and that just could have been like the cool factor for Miyazaki in putting him in. You're not walking everywhere? Sorry, America, find someone else. The real tragedy is we can't pull out one of those fire-breathing driver dudes from their vehicle and steal it Grand Theft Auto style.
He's not a character so much as a gameplay mechanic. Comparing him to Agro from Shadow of the Colossus, the contrast between the two steeds couldn't be more clear. Agro's delayed handling gives the impression of a real animal responding to suggestions. Agro won't jump off cliffs because a reasonably smart animal wouldn't do that. If Wander jumps off Agro, she'll move around autonomously, and in a battle she can get hit by the Colossus and she'll try and run out of the way, again reinforcing that she's an actual character. The lack of other mechanics during the long journeys to each Colossus means the player has nothing to focus on except riding Agro, strengthening the bond between the two. That bond is paid off when Agro sacrifices herself for Wander, and her character arc is completed when she heroically returns with an injury at the very end. In contrast, Torrent doesn't exist while you're not using him. He'll obey your controller inputs to the point of death, often despite your own best intentions. He has no autonomy, no personality, and no character development.
True.
He might look like an animal, but in reality he's just a button that you press to gain super speed and a double jump. Functionally, he'd be no different if he were a pair of magic boots. But even just considering him as a gameplay mechanic, Torrent is incredibly awkward and unintuitive. As an extension of the player's normal movement, Torrent's stationary jump should have been completely vertical like the player's, but instead he jumps forward, which makes platforming unnecessarily frustrating. Turning 180 degrees triggers a unique animation that rotates Torrent in place, but lesser turns cause him to move forward according to his previous velocity. What this means is that if you're trying to precisely maneuver Torrent while stationary, you'll usually end up walking off a cliff. At full speed, his turns take a wide arc, but if you turn too far, he'll abruptly slam on the brakes and zoom off in the opposite direction.
Yeah, the controls for Torrent could have used a little bit more refinement. I'll agree there.
This design is so strange, I honestly have no idea what the intention was, but the effect is to make his handling at any speed incredibly jarring. This is especially true in combat, where even more of the abrupt stops and starts are present because staggering Torrent instantly reduces his speed to 0. The camera never keeps up with Torrent's movement, and adjusting it requires the same thumb used for dashing. All of this is particularly disappointing because the open-world bosses were clearly designed to accommodate both mounted and pedestrian combat, and by trying to do both, it does neither very well.
Difference in the mic quality right there. That one was just really noticeable. Without horns, I meant to say hello to you earlier. Welcome back to the stream. Agro's the best horse in all of gaming. No other horses anywhere near enough horse-like behavior or their own inclination to going down specific routes. Yeah. No, it's all good, Crunchy. Sometimes that just happens. Whether or not you're fixing something in post and like, oh no, I need to go back. It's just kind of funny. And I'm a lot more sensitive to that stuff after like making my own content. Cannot argue against Torrent's existence. So watch Crunchy.
Besides the issues with characterization, handling, and combat, the worst part of Torrent is how destructive he is to engaging with the world. You can now escape from even the slightest threatening situation with the press of a button, and you're practically encouraged to race through the world spamming the dash button without stopping to take any of it in. Any sense of the size or grandeur of the world is instantly minimized by whizzing along through it at breakneck speed. There may not be an easy mode for combat, but Torrent is the easy mode for exploration.
True.
Demon Souls and Dark Souls.
So my solution to like Torrent would be having more areas that are like checkpointed. Not like literally checkpointed, but well, actually kind of literally checkpointed, just not in the game sense of the word checkpoint, where I think one of the best areas for this example would be like the little gap in the gate leading up to Stormvale, where you're just kind of in a ravine and you're tunneled into one direction. But even in there, Torrent can just allow you to literally run past everything. So if they included an enemy type that would like cast a spell to interrupt spirit summons, I think that could have added a lot of tension to different areas of the game. And by spirit summons, I'm also including Torrent under that kind of umbrella term because he's a spirit steed and you summon him. And Sordiero, welcome back to the stream. The problem is partially Torrent, but also the lack of incentive to engage in open world content. Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. I mean, there's a certain point to it on a first playthrough when you're just trying to explore and see if there's like random treasure points and chests or like caravans, and like chests in like encampments specifically. But yeah, like I've said before, the more you play Elden Ring, the worse it gets, which is kind of weird. Whereas I feel like some of the other games, like the better they got. Like Dark Souls 1 does get a lot better the more you play it because you become more familiar with the areas. You can start like doing a little bit more sequence break type stuff, although it's like honestly kind of really limited in my opinion, but I digress there. Crunchy's PFP doesn't match his voice and it keeps throwing you off. Yeah. Pretty much the first time we watched a Crunchy video, everyone's like, that is not the voice I expected at all. But anyway, Crunchy's got a good profile picture. He even recreated it in Armored Core, and it looks really good, actually.
Used traps, ambushes, environmental hazards, and enemy placement to encourage a slow, methodical approach to exploration. Rushing in blindly would usually get you killed, whereas you're rewarded for taking the time to carefully explore and develop an awareness of your surroundings. That methodical approach meshed extremely well with the thoughtful map design, environmental storytelling, and detailed artwork characteristic of FromSoft games, giving you more of a chance to take in everything you're seeing. Demon Souls and Dark Souls are enhanced by a slower pace of gameplay, because it gives the player time to think about the world's history, its inhabitants, and the player's own place and path through that world. Unfortunately, that methodical style of gameplay has slowly receded from each successive game. Stamina management is less important, healing is less costly, enemies are more consistently aggressive, combat is more reaction-based, and in a perverse twist of design, attack animations are more and more built around roll catching, input reading, and expected response times, punishing players for being more observant or getting good at previous games. Other changes, like the addition of respecs, changing your appearance, unkillable NPCs, and removing incentives to open yourself to invasions, are also part of the same broad trend. Less deliberate gameplay and less consequence. Respecking might at first sound like a good idea considering the size and difficulty of Elden Ring. Late game bosses can dish out unpredictable attacks with massive damage that will one-shot anyone without enough health. Players aren't expected to understand the value of different stats at first, so it seems reasonable to offer them a chance to rectify their mistakes with the benefit of hindsight, especially if they've already invested 100 hours into a character. There's several problems with this, however. If players are expected to pump more than 20 levels into health at minimum, perhaps the choice shouldn't even be there in the first place. Or at least, it calls into question the design of endgame bosses that force the vast majority of players into choosing a particular way. On the other hand, if the game doesn't communicate the overwhelming value of a particular stat, players shouldn't be punished later on for not choosing it. From this perspective, respecking is an admission from the developers of a flaw in the game's design.
So, that's an interesting point. I would kind of disagree with the last part there, but maybe you have a point. And yeah, there's kind of multiple ways I want to talk about this. So, what was the first point that I wanted to bring up? And then I got distracted by the second one. And I'm going to forget the second one when I go back to the first one. Oh, right. So the first point that I wanted to bring up is like the overabundance of levels in Elden Ring. Even though you do kind of level up a lot in Elden Ring, I don't think it's like that much worse than Dark Souls 2, now that I think about it. Because like I feel like the quote-unquote meta level to be good enough to beat Millennia at is probably around 140. that's probably the point where she's still pretty difficult, but not like overwhelmingly so. You could definitely do it at like 120. It'll just be like a little bit more of a pain in the ass, perhaps. So 140 is probably good for most people. Let's say like 150 to 160 is probably where most people are going to end up if they explore a lot at the end of the game. So I think part of the reason there's an inflation of levels is just because of like how many areas there are, and they want players to actually keep feeling rewarded for going through things like catacombs, caves, and side areas beyond just like items. So they need a certain amount of experience to go along with that. And you might have a point where vigor feels a hell of a lot more quintessential in Elden Ring than in previous titles. So perhaps they could have like increased the gains for each stat and just lowered the amount of experience given. But I fear that if they did that, other sections of the game might not feel as rewarding as a consequence of that. And it just would require a whole lot of time to go back and balance it numerically throughout each area, culminating into like the kind of final experience of the game. But I will absolutely 100% agree that towards the end of the game, there are a lot of issues with the balancing of the bosses and the kind of pseudo boss rush with like the Godskin Nobles, Malekith, kind of sort of Gideon, Godfrey / Horaloo, Radigan / Elden Beast. It is a little bit rough out there. And I guess the Fire Giant, if you really want to include him. All right. I do have another point, which I'm going to forget about, but let me read chat. Oh yeah, respecking. Clown Scum likes respecking. You just like trying new weapons without having to start a new game. Rephrasing Crunchy, respecking isn't a positive change that you want. It's an admission that the current build you're enjoying isn't viable moving forward. I would disagree with that, although I do think there's a kernel of truth to it, and I'll talk about that one next. You're expecting a FromSoft game to not punish for inattention and leveling vigor? Come on. The only reason Scaleezy respects is to change an old character. You dropped into a new one to avoid hours of prep work. The vigor check meme got very irritating for Sordier. You can't just expect newer players to naturally know how important vigor is. I think the worst vigor check in Elden Ring is Rykard, because he just has so much bullcrap going on in the second phase of his fight between the skull spam as well as the actual sword attacks that follow up along with it. I feel like they should have toned that down to be more reliably like dodge rolled or something. Revenant said, did he say Elden Ring bosses punish players for being observant and being good at the previous games? What? Yes. So you might have missed a little bit of the context that goes into that, and maybe Crunchy didn't explain it as well as he did, but it's something that I just kind of intuited, that in previous FromSoft games, there was a lot less delayed attacks. So when you saw an enemy starting its attack, there was a general favorable window in which you should either try to dodge out of the way or block. However, Elden Ring kind of subverts a lot of that for certain bosses by having more delayed attacks that are designed to roll catch players who would dodge at kind of the more consistent time frame compared to like other fights. So they kind of punish new players and they punish old players by kind of forcing them more to learn the actual patterns of enemy attacks rather than just being more observant and dealing with things in a more blanket one-size-fits-all fashion, which is both kind of a good and a bad thing. So I think this is like another case of like FromSoft strengths also doubling as their weaknesses. Without horns, played through all the games except for Elden Ring. It's a glass cannon without leveling vigor. Yeah, it's really easy to do that in the other games, but Elden Ring is a little bit more harsh on that front. HP should just be tied to level? Yeah, maybe. You never felt the need to respect other than when you found a weapon you really wanted to use, but that's not unique to Elden Ring in terms of FromSoft games. True. Like when Morgott raises his sword into the air and just holds it there for a second before swinging. Yeah, that's one attack that like stands out to me. I think Moog has a kind of similar attack where he raises his staff up, and the way that like his trident works is like he slams it down kind of similarly to Morgott, except he just has a hell of a lot of extra range. So it punishes people who roll backwards rather than side to side, which isn't that big a deal. It's just kind of a one event of like the kind of roll catch, which I think is a bit more fair than like the super delayed ones that catch people who didn't necessarily panic roll, but people who deliberately rolled, if that makes sense. So like deliberate roll catching versus panic roll catching, I think is the kind of criticism Crunchy might be trying to levy here. Astynex would tie HP to gear. That would make heavier gear better and make gaining health more natural. You take more hits because you have better armor. In an ideal world, armor would matter a lot more, wouldn't it? Alright, so going back to that whole idea of stats and respecking in general, I do think respecking is valuable, except I do think it's absolute dog poop garbage that the number of respecs are limited per new game plus cycle, with I think Elden Ring having like a fair amount at like 8 or 9 larval tiers that are available to get, maybe a bit more, but nonetheless there is a very hard limit. You can't buy them from a merchant as far as I'm aware, so good luck if you were very indecisive. Go back through an entire new game plus cycle if you're just focusing on PvP, you know? They could make it a lot more friendly that way. Or they could do the thing that I like was suggesting since my Bloodborne review, in that I don't necessarily think stats and stat requirements actually add anything to the game other than giving arbitrary gatekeeping points that might be relevant for PvP, if anything. So like if weapons just scaled with damage instead of like strength and their upgrades, that might be an effective thing to do, but it then becomes like a completely different game, and you have to restructure all of like the rewards that go with it in terms of like leveling up and all that other stuff. So it's very difficult to fix. Although I think I do kind of agree with what Crunchy is going for here. Not that I've listened to it fully. And then Crunchy said they think the issue with Vigor wouldn't be as bad if there weren't 1 unavoidable damage like Moog, or 2 incredibly aggressive input reading endgame bosses who can catch you in poise-breaking KO combos. Yeah. I feel like Margit is really bad, although he's an early boss who's kind of like a mid/late boss. But at least with Moog, I will be an apologist and say you can use the little flask tier, which I think it is a little bit unrealistic to expect a lot of players to get that purified crystal tier. It is kind of fairly available, to be fair, but maybe a little bit off the beaten path to get it, which is another thing. So the Moog one, it can be tanked if you spam heal. Maybe not so much at lower health, but he is a very late endgame boss there, so maybe you have a point. I don't know. But the other thing about the crystal tier is that you can use it at the very beginning of the fight, and then Nihil won't actually hurt you. I don't think people realize that. Scaleezy says, no LP, let me power level and dumpster the bosses. Just because you don't have to have like stats allocated to level doesn't mean you still can't get progressively stronger and then eventually dumpster the easier bosses. Nothingness says, by the way, I think getting roll caught means you're not as good at FromSoft games, panic rolling, or you just didn't pay attention to this boss. I think there's a bit of nuance to it where the issue is like the telegraphs aren't treated the same, and that certain bosses will catch deliberate roll attempts with their patterns, which aren't as visually distinctive as the ones where you can just dodge by panic rolling. But you are right, because if you're dodging at the wrong time, you're dodging at the wrong time. Except I feel like the visual indicators aren't as clear as they could be because of things like feints. But Then again, I feel like adding feints or even like deliberate roll catches adds a layer of complexity to combat, which I can't fully begrudge. It's just, I feel like perhaps with combining the roll catch stuff with the absolute aggression of a lot of these bosses, it can feel a little bit overwhelming for a decent chunk of players. Crunchy says, there's a natural rhythm to the preparation phase of an attack, which predicts a certain point in time. If it's delayed, it means you can't predict it. This is about memorization, not observation. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel, where in Elden Ring specifically, it's more about pattern recognition than observation and adjusting based off those observations. So I am in most agreement with that right there. And as Nothingness points out, and this is a good point, armor giving too many stats would kill fashion souls and mess with balance. You just wear Havel and Prophet and Bull Goat looks like poop. So there is a bit of interplay that goes with it, and they could potentially balance armors differently by having more meaningful distinctions between the bonuses provided. So, as you said, that's a completely different balance adjustment to make, and definitely goes way beyond the scope of this discussion here, though. So I'll just leave that alone for now and go back into the video.
Even as a concession, the sheer number of respecs available in a single playthrough is excessive. With 18 accessible larval tiers, many challenges can be easily bypassed with a quick trip to Renala at low cost. If you're having trouble with a boss as a melee build, instead of thinking tactically about position and attack timing, you can simply turn into a glass cannon mage and melt them with a high-level spell, then change back into your melee build for the small price of 2 larval tiers. 1 or 2 available respecs might be considered a safety net, but 18 seems more like an invitation to use a boring gamey menu element to cheese through tough areas.
And part of the reason why I would disagree with having so many larval tiers being a bad thing is a lot of people will play PvP, and I think it's absolutely ludicrous to expect people to play through the game each time to get a certain build up off the ground, which, I mean, people have to do it already, but that's kind of why I feel like it's a bit ludicrous already.
It's curious that the ability to upgrade armor from Dark Souls 1 and 2 never returned in the following games. Besides mediating against an imbalanced distribution of stats, armor upgrades gave players the opportunity to invest in a particular look and build, encouraging them to be more consistent in their roleplay and become more immersed in the world as a result. More than anything, Elden Ring's respecs, along with infinite character customization, work against the feeling of commitment to a unique character that should have been important to a game so focused on the individual experience of every player.
I totally understand what you're saying there. However, I think that is anathema to the core design philosophy of Elden Ring, and that they wanted to maximize player freedom. And I feel like some of their systems kind of made concessions to that idea, and it might have been better for the overall health of the game if they did pare that back a little bit. But yeah, I appreciate the point nonetheless. Goblin Man, the Green Goblin. Ponyboy says, you think having limited respecs at all is disappointing. People will play how they want to play. That won't affect how you play or enjoy the game. So yeah, I feel like it should have been all or nothing. Either make respecs completely free or have them being like ridiculously limited would probably be better. Nothingness thinks that overall roll catches added to the game. Panic rolling your way to victory in DS3 just felt like cheating or just not legitimate in some cases. So there's a difference between panic rolling and roll catching. So, as I was saying, deliberate roll catches to me are things like... What's a good example of a deliberate roll catch that an enemy has? Margit just kind of always pops out to me. Not the one that just like appears over his head because it's so delayed, because if you don't panic roll, you're fine. He has certain attacks which were more like deliberate roll catches that I just can't think of. The spear meta, let me kind of want to pull up some footage. So full disclosure, my 1.0 playthrough against Margit was really rough in terms of how many times he beat the crap out of me. Do I not have my 1.0 stuff on here? Well, if I died to Morgott 2, this must be embarrassing. Let's fast forward. Obviously, me getting there's not a big deal. I got lucky there. I think I just did not respect him right then. Yeah, okay, that one was just totally me sucking. Let's do this one. If I get killed. Oh yeah. So stuff like that is a little bit tough to deal with because it's really hard to understand how much spacing you need against some of these bosses. So obviously, like, he was winding up, and maybe that's not the best time for me to heal, but oof. That one feels a little bit bad, but you know, still my fault. I just don't know the positioning for it. It's really hard, I feel like, in Elden Ring especially, to judge when an enemy is open during a combo, or like when combos are ending, and when you can like actually hit them. And I feel like Margit is just really bad about that in general. And of course, like right now I'm being a little bit nitpicky because I'm just trying to... Oh yeah. Let me rewatch that sequence. Just because I'm trying to like get a very quick example, so I'm being a lot more critical than I normally would be. So that, okay, that one I definitely rolled too soon, so I'm not going to say like, oh, well, actually, maybe that's actually the perfect example of like a roll catch. Rolled once. So I know that he's comboing, so I'm trying to avoid the next hit, and then that's kind of like a roll catch. Because I feel like I should be out of the range of like the visual hitbox there. All right, I get up. I see that he's kind of idling. I back up to get a little bit of extra space for like a thrust or something. I try to heal. Okay, so he's in this animation now. Wait, no, but so am I. So there's just inopportune timing for me. All right. Oh. So yeah, maybe just ever so slightly off timing with my heal there. Oh, that one's rough. That one's rough. Okay. But this is kind of a cool attack. Like, I'm not too upset. So, like, this is a really good misdirect. And then I was not paying attention to a sword, so that's my fault. But it's a little bit rough. And then that, of course, is another one that really makes people upset. The little daggers don't bother me too much, although they can feel a little bit much. All right, sorry. Margit holds it for 2.5 seconds, then rushes and waits again before hitting. Margit is super fun once you learn him. Fortunately, the only way you learn him is repetition and trial and error. And I think that's the issue. It's that you actually have to learn his pattern of attacks rather than relying a bit more on observation, as Crunchy would put it. That 1.0 UI. I love how everyone always talks about the 1.0 UI. Don't sell myself short, that's a bad move. I mean, I'm going to take an L when I take an L, you know, but you might be right. Elden Ring has atrocious AoE. You love how he summons weapons made of grace? You wish there was a way to practice bosses that didn't involve repetitive death and loading screens. So when we first fought Godfrey, and I resisted saying it when Crunchy brought him up earlier in the video, in the Everjail, I was like, oh my god, you can refight bosses in Everjails? This game is going to be amazing, just like a boss rush mode in the Everjail. That would have been so peak for me, and then it was only Godfrey, and I was a sad boy. So yeah, hopefully with the DLC, we get more like boss rush incorporation into the Everjails, right guys? The DLC will fix it.
Elden Ring is about having an adventure unique to each person. It's hard to think of anything more contradictory to that idea than the ability to repeatedly change your character's shape, size, sex, and stats at little to no cost. Other newly introduced mechanics aren't as destructive as the copious respecs or torrent, but many of them aren't well developed either. Spirit Ashes are in theory a fun addition that give players more ways to express themselves, but in practice they become cheap tools to take advantage of enemies' inability to deal with multiple opponents.
Yeah.
Something to personalize the spirits and endear them to the player was missing here. Besides Mimic Tier and the few spirits that...
And this I'm gonna kind of blame on the community at large for just taking the easy route out and being like, oh, Google, what's the most powerful Spirit Ash? And then you get like OP Mimic Tier builds and Black Knife Teach, and that's pretty much it. GG, no re. Obviously, like some of my favorite memes about like the best Spirit Ash being the Mimic Tier is like the Gru meme where it's like, get the Mimic Tier, the best Spirit Ash in the game. It sucks. It sucks. You know, it's like implying that the player character's build sucks. Like, what a rude awakening. That one's just absolutely hilarious to me. But anyway. No, yeah, that's kind of my running joke about like the DLC fixing everything. So I'm not actually on the copium. It's just kind of fun to make fun of people who are.
Respond to Warcry, there's no way to affect the behavior of spirits once summoned. Some basic AI customization would have gone a long way towards getting players more invested in their spirit.
Actually, you can throw a Cursed Blood Pot, and that will make them more aggressive, actually.
Upgrades could have been improved as well. Instead of collectible upgrades, it wouldn't be too difficult to make spirits upgrade with experience alongside the player, again creating more of a bond between spirit and player. Unlike
Fudge, I was muted. Okay. Alright. More lore said, yeah, the developers putting the overpowered Ash in the games is the player's fault for using it. And, it's because I pressed spacebar. That makes sense. And you're definitely right about that. And I was saying while I was muted that back in the old days, a lot of that stuff was just done through trial and error, like figuring out what was good or bad. But now it's just on day 3, like pretty much everything is figured out, and people are like putting out guides, or even earlier when they get like review versions to look at before it's officially released. So I think I did have more fun when I was only using the underpowered Spirit Ashes, like the Jellyfish or the Skelebros. So there is something to be said about that. That maybe we just had too many OP Spirit Ashes, but I feel like some of the issues with Spirit Ashes that most are gated with FP, and a lot of builds don't want to use FP and like level it, whereas the Mimic Tier Ashes could literally be used for any player because they're summoned with HP. And I did say some other stuff before that, but I forgot it all. Oh, okay, no. So I was saying with leveling up Spirit Ashes with experience is a cool idea in theory, especially if they're getting more levels as, like, more attacks as they level up. However, it would be extremely tedious, I think, for a large chunk of players to want to feel compelled to level up, like, the 60 or so Spirit Ashes that they actually have in the game. Because, hey, it's me, people. So I kind of appreciate that they didn't go that route. And yeah, I don't know what like the more elegant solution is there. You can use the Cerulean Burst tier to summon any Ash for free, only if you have the requisite amount of FP to begin with. So if like a Spirit Ash costs 141 FP and I only have like 89. I'm pretty certain you can't cast it still. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was my understanding at least. Gotta ash them all.
Blocking specific attacks after sufficient battle experience
Oh, I'm wrong?
might take
Okay.
more work to implement, but would also enhance the feeling of investment. Elden Ring's more versatile jumping opens up the world in new ways, which happily the level design often takes advantage of, but in combat it's more of an afterthought. Any attack which is designed to be avoided by jumping can also be avoided by rolling, and the path of least resistance means that it's more convenient to just roll through everything instead of switching back and forth between the two strategies.
Yes and no. Yes, you're totally right that you can just dodge through all of the jumping style attacks. However, you miss out on being able to follow up with a jump attack, which can be extremely advantageous, especially if you're using like a big boy build with a colossal weapons. So you're not wrong, and that's kind of what I was saying. Like, I do wish that they incorporated some of the other lessons that they learned from Sekiro into Elden Ring, but obviously they didn't or couldn't. So I think Goomba Stomp would have been a good one, or if they made like slam attacks non-rollable, that could be really cool, because that's something that they're going to do in like Path of Exile 2 rather, where enemies that do slams will catch all rolls, so you need to get out of their AoE type stuff, but all of your rolls will still dodge like all like normal attacks completely. You thought jumping was added for strength build easy mode? Indeed.
Removing the ability to roll through these ground attacks would fix this, but enemy ground attacks don't offer players unique offensive opportunities either, so there isn't much depth to the mechanic regardless. Great runes theoretically incentivize co-op, but rune arcs are abundant offline as well, and besides Melania's rune, none of them fundamentally affect gameplay anyway.
Crunchy says that's fair. You were thinking more in terms of longer range moves. Yeah. And of course, I think the counterpoint to what I said is they don't telegraph a lot of slam attacks well enough to make it feel like a fleshed out mechanic. So maybe if more like smaller enemies had a couple of them, like Storm Stomp, they could like help teach it to players perhaps. But yeah, a lot of attacks that I've seen people get caught with that they didn't know they could jump over, I'm like, oh, you can just jump over that one. Like I think the best example of that is the Elden Beast ring attack. I've seen so many people get caught by it because they didn't know you're supposed to jump over it. I think that's like literally the only one where you can't like roll through it. Or you can roll through it, but it just slows you down, so you still get caught by the explosion, I think. Something like that. Yeah, Godfrey and Radigan are bosses that incentivize jumping a lot. Wait, does Radigan do it? Oh yeah, kind of a little bit. No, I think some of his stuff still catches jumps. But I think, yeah, when I think of jumping attacks, and I think of like Godfrey and the Crucible Knights specifically. Jump attack windows are so inconsistent. Why can't Margit's hammer be jump attacked? What was I going to say? Oh yeah, I do think one weakness of jump attacks on the player's part is just how terrible the tracking is for like a lot of weapons. But to be fair, like jump attacks are just also extremely strong. They're extremely strong and kind of bad at the same time. It's really weird.
Crafting is functional but bare bones. Sleep fills a role missing from the cast of status effects in previous games, but it's overshadowed by other much more useful effects like Bleed and Frost, which
I feel like the issue with sleep is that there isn't enough builds that enable sleep, or like enough weapons or Ashes of War. And I feel like that's a really big problem of Elden Ring in general, where like a lot of these really cool options are just completely gated by accessibility. So the Black Flame Blade buff, I know they changed it at some point, but I think it used to only last for like 6 seconds, which is extremely low, and you don't have an access to like a prayer book later on to get a buff that like lasts for like 30 seconds or something along those lines. And there's like no Ash of War to give your like weapon Black Flame style damage. Just one example that comes to mind. And so if they made all of these access to these different stat effects like more equalized, I think that'd probably be better for like build variety in general. But yeah, Frost and Bleed are just disgustingly broken.
even after 6 months of patches, are atrociously imbalanced. There's a host of other minor balancing issues which would take hours to fully explore. This isn't surprising given the size of Elden Ring, but maybe it didn't have to be so big in the first place. Whatever it gains in size and scope, it also loses in concision and clarity. It's a game that does a lot of different things, but not all of them are done really well. That doesn't mean that the trade-off wasn't always a good idea, however. Descending into the Shifa River and realizing that there's a whole world underneath your feet, or watching the map double in size as it zooms out, these are experiences that could only happen because of Elden Ring's size.
Could you imagine how terrifying it would be if they had like more of the wraith colors that are on like horseback, like have their horses be faster than torrent, and so that way they could like catch up to the player, turn around, ring their bell, and then your torrent would disappear, and then they would like start summoning more wraiths around you. That would be some crazy stuff. Like, not, maybe it shouldn't actually be added into the game, but just thinking of like random things they could have done to make the world feel a bit more alive, and that like torrent wasn't always the like get out of dodge free card. Ponyboy found the clip of the rune bear. Nice. Share it in the Discord or in the video comments, and I'll like try to check it out later. Was Frost as good in Dark Souls 3? Oh, absolutely not. In Dark Souls 3, it pretty much only stopped... Well, it didn't even really stop it. It, like, slowed, mitigated. It made healing worse for enemies, and I don't think it actually slowed them. But if so, maybe it's only, like, 10%, something pretty, like, negligible. Like, Frost is extremely good in Elden Ring. As long as they don't summon revenants, yeah. No, I just meant like the little ones, unless you get into like a specific spot. Who knows? The revenants should have come out at night all over the lands. That was something that I'm a little bit surprised Crunchy didn't bring up. This is something that I definitely want to bring up in my review of Elden Ring, that there's literally no point in playing the game at morning or even in the afternoon, because literally only all of the differences in the overworld happen at night. So I guess the only reason why you wouldn't want to play at night is if you don't want to get mobbed by more like random bat mobs. But that's pretty much it. If you do play through the day, you're missing out on all the Knight's Cavalry as well as the Deathbirds. So they should have done more with the day and night cycle and or like the weather stuff if they wanted to incorporate it as strongly as they did. Yeah, Nothingness uses Frost for burst damage against scale only. Oh, in Dark Souls 3. You'd stack poison and frost and then whack him to death. Okay, going back to the video.
The feelings of wonder, openness, and freedom that this game provides couldn't be achieved on a smaller scale. If you had to ask me whether the open world was worth it, I'd probably say yes, but with the caveat that I hope this is a one-time thing. I hope it doesn't become...
Yeah, I would agree that I do feel like the open world makes it worth it to an extent, especially for a first playthrough. It was just really, really good, provided you kind of know what you're already doing and not screwing yourself with your build options. But do I want them to make another open world game? Maybe, but not like next. So it really depends on what they do with the DLC. If they revitalize the world that we already have, I could see like a lot of potential in like making the game better. Because the sky is kind of the limit. So like with Elden Ring as a base framework, if they just added to it like organically, it could make it so much better than it already is, which is kind of crazy to think of. And if they don't and just add a bit more like legacy dungeon type stuff, it's understandable if a little bit disappointing. So yeah, so I do want kind of a return to the more focused level-based development, which you kind of get with like Armored Core to an extent in another setting. So if they do another open world game, I want it to be like a couple years down the line, perhaps, with a lot of these lessons kind of taken to heart and improved upon. Isn't there one merchant in Limgrave that won't sell you stuff during night? Oh, maybe. So yeah, I mean, in earlier parts of development, they did want like more sleep quest based stuff, but that got cut. I don't know if there's a merchant that doesn't sell to you at night, and if there isn't, you could probably just hit him once and wake him up. You want another Sekiro style game, like an ancient Japan one, or just in general, like in terms of like action combat.
Become the template for future FromSoft games, because it doesn't play to their strengths. The more compact design of Dark Souls and Demon Souls worked in tandem with the slow, methodical gameplay to highlight the best features of both games. Carefully crafted levels, nuanced environmental storytelling, detailed art design, poignant experiences which emerge naturally from gameplay, a commitment to immersion, and an atmosphere which is completely unique. All of those things exist in Elden Ring, but they're more spread out. There's more padding in between, which dilutes the impact of those features and leaves the game feeling somewhat unfocused. The huge amount of content is there to support the overarching vision of a vast open world, but ironically it often just muddies the waters and makes that vision feel less cohesive. FromSoft might continue to make even bigger and more ambitious games in the future, but personally I'd like to see something smaller and simpler. Something that does a little more with a little less.
I love Crunchy, you fool, you absolute buffoon. You didn't give yourself like 10 seconds for title cards at the end, as well as an opportunity for me to pause it and be reminded to like and subscribe to your video. But no, that was a great video. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'm going to go ahead and link it into chat for you all to give him a like and a sub if you enjoyed it as well. And once again, Crunchy, thank you so much for joining us in the stream tonight. It was really nice having you here. I appreciate it a lot. So, with that being said, I wanted to mention this point earlier because somebody in chat had mentioned like they wanted a really robust mine where you could get everything. So, it kind of reminded me of Ruin-strewn Precipice. I think that area is like one of the best areas in Elden Ring, and it's kind of very small and very self-contained, and it gets players from point A to point B and gives them an alternative way to access Altus Plateau. And I think if they took that design philosophy of the Ruin-strewn Precipice area, but applied it a bit more robustly throughout the entire world map, where you had kind of like closed off, more segmented areas of the world, it could work better. Like imagine if there was a tunnel that connected Limgrave and went underneath like the sea and then like went up into Weeping Peninsula, so you could go in from like one part of a catacomb and end out like the next. That would have been really cool. I think the closest that you get to that is like when you go down the sewers in Langdell, you have the option to go to like the Frenzy Flame Prescription or the Langdell Catacombs, but it doesn't really connect to anywhere else, unfortunately. So if they just blocked off more segments of the map to make Torrent less viable, I think it could have like improved parts of the game. But nonetheless, like as Crunchy was saying, like the ending areas do suffer a lot from like lack of enemy variety, reuse of assets, and just a kind of really high sudden jump in the difficulty spike, especially with like the final boss rushes. So yeah, that's kind of my ending thoughts on the video right now. Base take, completely agree. You like this spicy discourse? Great, man. It's very nice having you. All right, everybody, make sure you give Crunchy a like. That was a good video. Gave me a lot more food for thoughts. Also very glad that you and I both agree on the absolute bombasticness of the OSTs kind of muddying the waters there. Yeah, imagine if there's a game the size of Elden Ring with the interconnected nature of DS1. That's kind of always been the dream. They did some pretty good stuff with Elden Ring so far, but if they just iterated on that formula a bit more, which they've kind of been iterating on their formula a little bit more with each game, they could make something better. But yeah, going back to that whole idea of like the Twitch-based combat, I enjoy it to a degree, but I feel like it could have used a little bit more refinement. It does feel like they didn't use the caves coming out to unexpected places on the overworld all that often. Yeah, I think the best example of that would just be getting teleport trapped into either Caelid or Altus Plateau / the Divine Tower in Langdell. So they could have had more tunnel type stuff. You think it's harder to get faster combat right? Yeah, you might be right about that. So it's kind of curious to see how Lords of the Fallen is going to shape up in a couple months. Because I know a lot of people are negative about it because it does look slower and more deliberate. And obviously, we've only seen like the beginning portions of the game. So I am apprehensively hopeful, if that makes sense. Is there a duration limit for the videos I watch? Because you see Noah's video there. So yeah, I don't intend to really watch this on stream. My general duration limit, I think I've discovered, is probably around like 130 or 140, just because the time that I react to a lot of these videos adds to them. So it just depends. So this one I kind of put here for my own purposes. I don't know if I'll watch it on stream because it's extremely long and not like super lore intensive. And this was just some like a byproduct of a discussion from like a previous stream. But yeah. If you guys do have any more videos you want me to watch on stream, make sure you let me know in the video comments or on the Discord. The Discord is linked up top and also in my video description. So that would be appreciated because I'm actually getting kind of near the end here. I've added a couple more things like a little bit recently, but need to start looking for more content because, yeah. All right. That'll pretty much be it for me tonight. Once again, everybody, thank you for joining in. 80% of my stream video is responding to comments about belly buttons, hands, and feet lore. Indeed. Absolute truth. Yeah. So that'll be it for me. Remember to send me all of those in-game belly button pics that we were talking about yesterday. And do the cool algorithm stuff of liking and all that. Tomorrow we'll be going live again. I'm thinking with Smotown's video about Radigan of the Golden Order. And maybe what is the Rune of Destined Death a little bit before that. So, yeah, that sounds like a good combo there for tomorrow. Till then, you all stay safe. Hopefully we'll catch you on the next stream. Going live again, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard tomorrow. That's it for me tonight. Take care. Last Protagonist out.